Chapter 1. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating the dust of the trail into a fine, choking powder. Down below the wagon trace, a river snaked through the valley, its water shallow and deceptively clear, glittering like a vein of silver in the hardpan earth. It was there, at the ford, that hell had opened its gates. Rip Campbell saw it from a low ridge, the scene unfolding like a devil's pantomime. He was a cowboy on the drift, looking to pick up work with a ranch, when he came across the bushwhacked wagon train. His mare Sandy, a tough sand-colored Mustang with more sense than most men, stamped a hoof, her ears pricked forward, smelling the blood on the wind. A group of bandits, garishly dressed as Comanche raiders with daubed-on paint and stolen feathers, were swarming the wagons midstream. Their war cries were tinny and false, lacking the guttural conviction of true warriors. Rip's eyes narrowed. He saw the scuffed toes of cavalry boots beneath a breechcloth. The glint of a whiskey bottle passed between two of the attackers as they cornered a screaming woman. These weren't Indians. This was something uglier. A volley of rifle fire cracked from the wagons, but it was panicked and poorly aimed. The pioneers were outgunned and outmaneuvered, caught in the open water. Rip didn't weigh the odds. He didn't consider the 20 miles that separated him from a hot meal and a soft bed. He saw the wolf at the throat of the sheep, and his hand moved on its own, drawing the Colt from its worn leather holster. He dug his heels into Sandy's flanks. The mare surged down the slope, a blur of motion and intent. Rip fired twice from the saddle, his shots spaced and deliberate. The first slug caught the bandit with the whiskey bottle high in the chest, spinning him around into the river with a choked cry. The second shot took the horse out from under another, sending the rider tumbling into the churning water and mud. The ambushers wheeled around, their feigned war whoops dying in their throats, replaced by curses. They saw a lone rider, a silhouette against the blazing sun, charging headlong into their midst. It wasn't the numbers that gave them pause. It was the sheer, reckless audacity of the act. This wasn't a settler. This was something else. This was a predator. Rip rode to the rescue, but he was just one man. He fired again, scattering their formation, turning their attack into a frantic defense. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough to make it sing. He wasn't trying to kill them all, just to break the charge. He was a force of chaos thrown against their own, and it was enough. With panicked glances at their fallen men, the bandits broke off, kicking their ponies back toward the far bank and disappearing into the brush. Rip pulled Sandy to a halt in the middle of the river, the water swirling around his boots. The sudden silence was more profound than the gunfire had been. It was filled with the groans of the wounded and the soft, desolate weeping of a child. "They'll be back," he warned, his voice a low drawl that cut through the stunned quiet. He looked toward the wagon master, a burly, red-headed man who was clutching a shoulder leaking blood from the graze of a bullet. "We must bury our dead," the redhead answered, his voice thick with pain and defiance. "We can't leave them out for the animals." The people stared up at him from their waterlogged wagons, their eyes wide and hollow. Rip saw their stark, skinny faces, etched with the hardship of the trail, and now glazed with fresh horror. He saw a woman with flint in her eyes, and a small girl hiding in her skirts, the widow Clara Bell, though he didn't know her name yet. He saw a sallow-faced man with a twitchy gaze, who looked away the moment Rip's eyes met his, her brother Elias. And he saw a boy, maybe 14, with a smudge of dirt on his cheek, staring at Rip as if he were a figure from a legend. For a long moment, Rip felt the powerful urge to leave. He could turn Sandy's head and ride away, reminding himself that this sorry lot wasn't his problem. They weren't his responsibility. He had a few coins in his pocket for whiskey, and the town of Prospect Ridge wasn't far. People died on the Pioneer Trail every day. The West was a graveyard, and shallow, unmarked resting places lined the trail from Missouri to the Pacific. His gaze drifted to the ground where the bandits had been. He saw the clear, deep print of a cavalry boot in the mud. A few feet away, a brass shell casing glinted, military issue, not the reloaded shells a savvy Indian might use. His foster father's words echoed in his mind, a familiar cynical refrain, "You can't fix stupid, Rip." And heading west without hired guns for protection was stupid. These people hadn't just been unlucky, they had been careless. He let out a long breath, the dust of the trail and the scent of blood filling his lungs. He almost did it. He almost pulled the reins and left them to their fate. But then he saw the boy Tommy still watching him, his fear mingled with a desperate shining hope. "All right, fella," Rip drawled, his voice resigned. "There's a town about 20 miles in that direction." He pointed over his shoulder with his thumb, his eyes once more roving over the bedraggled crowd. "You want to bury your dead here," he said, his voice hard as iron. "We circle these wagons, and you take every pistol and rifle you got and get ready. Because they will be back before the sun is down. You fight, and maybe you bury some more of your own right here." He scanned the horizon, as if saying the words might summon the killers back. He let the grim reality of that sink in. "Or," he continued, his tone softening just a fraction, "we wrap your dead in canvas, put 'em all in one wagon, and we ride. We ride as fast as these tired mules can pull us, and we don't stop till we see the lights of town. It'll take the rest of the day and half the night. If you stay, I'm riding on. But if you head for town, I'm headed that way too. And I'll ride with you." The wagon master, Bram, didn't hesitate for long. The choice was between a graveyard here and a chance there. "Wrap the dead," he bellowed, his voice cracking with grief and urgency. "Into the last wagon. Move, people, move." As the settlers scrambled to obey, a grim and terrible efficiency taking over, Rip backed Sandy out of the river. He watched from the saddle while the mare greedily munched on the rich green grass at the water's edge. His eyes, however, never settled. They swept from the nervous pioneers to the darkening sky, from the rocky bluffs to the deep shadows stretching across the land. He was no longer a drifter just passing through. He had made their fight his own, and he was on the hunt for the trouble he knew was coming. Chapter 2. A collective shudder ran through the pioneers, a single organism of grief and fear. But O'Sullivan's orders, raw-edged and torn from his throat, were a splash of cold water. The weeping became muffled. The stunned paralysis gave way to a grim, mechanical movement. Men and women slid from the wagon beds into the river, their faces masks of misery, as they began the terrible work. Rip Campbell watched for only a moment, his jaw tight. He nudged Sandy's ribs, turning the mare away from the sorrowful tableau. There was a job to do, and it wasn't wrapping the dead. It was keeping the living from joining them. "I'll be back," he said to the air, though his eyes met the wide, watching gaze of the boy, Tommy, who nodded as if Rip had handed him a sacred oath. Rip put Sandy into a canter, riding a wide circle around the wagons, his eyes not on the pioneers but on the ground. He rode to the far bank, where the attackers had vanished. The place stank of wet horses and something else, something sharp and sour. He dismounted, letting Sandy's reins trail. The mare wouldn't wander. The tracks were a mess, a churned-up scramble of a hasty retreat. But there was no art to it. No effort to hide their trail. A real war party, Comanche or Kiowa, would have ridden over rock, used every trick to melt back into the land. These men had just fled. Rip knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of a hoofprint. A heavy horse, shod with a thick iron shoe. Not the light, unshod ponies of the Plains tribes. He moved methodically through the brush. 20 feet from the riverbank, half hidden under a scrubby bush, was the first bottle. Too cheap whiskey, its label peeling. A few steps further, another. Indians prized firewater, but they didn't leave it behind. Then he saw the glint of brass. He picked up a shell casing, rolling it in his palm. 3 Winchester. Same as his own. Common enough. But as he scanned the ground, he found more, and among them, the heavier casings of a Springfield carbine. Military issue. Rip rose and walked to the crest of a small rise, the spot where the attack had likely been staged. Here, the signs were even clearer. Dozens of bootprints scarred the earth, the distinct heel and sole pattern of men on foot. He saw a discarded cheroot, still damp. He crumbled it between his fingers. The tobacco was still fresh. This wasn't a raid. It was a military-style ambush executed by undisciplined men. Men playing dress-up. White men. He stood there, letting the pieces click into place. The shod horses, the whiskey, the bootprints, the false war cries. A cold knot formed in his stomach. This wasn't a random attack. This was a calculated act of terror, designed to look like something it wasn't. And that made it infinitely more dangerous. He swung back into the saddle and rode back toward the river, his face a granite mask. The scene at the ford was even more desolate up close. The pioneers had dragged their dead to the grassy bank. A tall, gaunt man with a nervous tic, Elias, the one who wouldn't meet his eye, was clumsily trying to rip a sheet of canvas. Nearby, the widow Clara held her daughter May close, shielding the child's eyes from the bodies of their neighbors. Rip dismounted and strode directly to Bram. The big man was leaning against a wagon wheel, his face pale. A balding man with whiskey on his breath and a surprisingly steady hand was cinching a bandage tight around Bram's bloody shoulder. "Doc Chilton," the man grunted. "Best I can do without my tools." Rip ignored him. He looked Bram square in the eye. They weren't Indians. Bram's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on Rip. "What are you talking about?" "I found their tracks," Rip said, his voice low and flat. "Bootprints all over the ridge. Left behind whiskey bottles and Springfield shell casings. Their horses were shod. This was white men, dressed up for a slaughter." 5. Doc Chilton froze. Elias stopped fumbling with the canvas. A hush fell over the small group. Bram stared at Rip, a new kind of dread dawning in his eyes, darker than the pain from his wound. He seemed to shrink, the bluster draining out of him. He let out a ragged breath. "Creed," he whispered, the name like a curse. "Creed?" Rip pressed. "The Creed gang," Bram said, his voice gaining a shaky strength. "We heard tell of them back at Fort Dodge. Said they were animals. Ex-Confederate, guerrillas who never quit the war." 6. Who leads them? Rip's question was sharp as a skinning knife. "A man named Silas Creed," Bram answered, his gaze dropping to the ground. "They call him Smiley." 7. The name was so absurd, so contrary to the bloody work they just witnessed, that it was utterly chilling. "They say he smiles while he kills. Says it's the only time he feels right with God." Rip digested this, the cold knot in his gut twisting tighter. This changed everything. A random Indian attack was a force of nature. This was personal. This was a sickness. Smiley Creed wasn't just a bandit, he was a man who enjoyed his work. And he wouldn't be scared off for long. "This ain't just a robbery then," Rip stated. "It's a hunt." "They wanted us to scatter," Bram said, looking at the bodies on the grass. "Wanted us panicked. Easier to pick us off, one by one." Rip looked from the determined set of Bram's jaw, to the quiet strength in Clara's face as she comforted her daughter, to the raw fear in Elias's eyes. He saw Doc Chilton take a subtle pull from a flask. He saw young Tommy, now helping roll a body onto a sheet of canvas, his movements clumsy but resolute. This was his charge. A wagon train full of ghosts and frightened souls, led by a wounded man, hunted by a smiling killer. He had given them a choice, and they had chosen. Now he had to make his own. The road to Prospect Ridge had just become a long, open grave. He could still leave. No one had paid him. No one could stop him. He could ride away and let Smiley Creed have his fun. But he looked at Bram, who met his gaze, not pleading, but with the flat, dead-eyed look of a man facing his own end. He thought of the boot prints, the cheap deception, the sheer malice of it all. This wasn't just bad luck. It was an evil that needed answering. "All right, Bram," Rip said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "You're gonna get your people to Prospect Ridge." He paused, letting the wagon master hang on the unspoken clause. "Because I'm gonna ride with you." 8. A collective sigh of relief went through the settlers who had been listening. It wasn't loud, but it was palpable, a physical easing of tension. "Get your dead loaded," Rip commanded, his voice taking on a new authority. "We ride in 20 minutes. We don't stop for hell or high water." He turned, his gaze sweeping over all of them, the living and the dead. The graveyard would have to wait. Chapter 3. Rip's words hung in the air, heavier than the humid stench of blood and river mud. For a moment, the pioneers just stared, as if his promise to stay was a language they'd forgotten how to speak. Then the spell broke. A man sobbed once, a choked, desperate sound, before stuffing the noise back down his throat. Action, grim and final, took over. "You heard him!" Bram roared, his voice cutting through the haze of grief. He winced as the movement pulled at his bandaged shoulder, but his eyes were steel. "The last wagon. Unload the flour sacks. Anything that ain't essential. Pilot. That's the death wagon now." The work was a horror. Husbands wrapped their wives in sailcloth. A mother, her face a blank mask of stone, bundled her teenage son. The tearing of canvas was the only sound for long minutes, a rough, rasping counterpoint to the gentle murmur of the river. Rip gave them their moment. He strode to Sandy, pulled his Winchester from its scabbard, and began checking the action, the metallic click-clack a cold, methodical rhythm. He walked the line of wagons, his eyes taking in the sorry state of their arsenal. He was no general, but he knew a losing hand when he saw one. He stopped by a man struggling to load a percussion rifle. "That primed?" Rip asked. The man, whose face was streaked with dirt and tears, looked up confused. I loaded it this morning." "The powder's wet," Rip said, pointing to the dark stain of river water on the man's coat. "It'll misfire." "Useless." He didn't wait for an answer, moving on. He saw old fowling pieces, a few cap-and-ball revolvers, and not nearly enough ammunition. This wasn't a wagon train. It was a line of rolling coffins waiting for the final nails. He came to Clara Bell's wagon. The woman worked with a quiet, fierce efficiency, her hands sure as she tied off a canvas shroud. Her brother Elias Dunn stood beside her, wringing his hands, his face pale and slick with sweat. He held a rifle, but he held it like a dead fish. "You know how to use that?" Rip's question was a whip crack. Elias flinched. "I can shoot." "Hitting what you're aiming at is the trick," Rip said, his gaze hard. "When the time comes, you point it at one of them and you pull the trigger. You don't think. You don't pray. You pull it. You do it again. You understand me?" "You've no right to order me," Elias snapped, a flash of resentment in his eyes. Clara looked up, her own eyes blazing. "Elias, hush. The man is trying to save our lives." She turned her gaze to Rip, and for a second he saw the full weight of her loss, the terror she was holding at bay for the sake of her daughter. But behind it was a core of pure iron. "We're grateful for your help, Mr. Campbell." "Gratitude won't stop a bullet," Rip replied, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "Just be ready." He glanced inside the wagon where the little girl, May, sat clutching a rag doll, her eyes enormous. Rip looked away, a muscle tightening in his jaw. He found the boy, Tommy, struggling to help two other men heave a shrouded body toward the death wagon. The boy's face was set with grim determination, his skinny arms straining. "Boy," Rip called out. Tommy dropped his corner of the load and practically ran over, his eagerness a stark contrast to the grim scene. "Yes, sir?" "Go to every wagon. Find every canteen. Fill them in the river. Every last one. We don't stop again till we're through. That's the most important job right now. Can you do it?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said, his shoulders squaring. He ran off, a boy with a man's purpose. The last body was loaded. The canvas flaps of the death wagon were drawn shut, a final awful curtain. It sat there at the end of the train, a squat, terrible monument to their failure. The pioneers stood near their own wagons, clutching their meager weapons, their faces hollowed out. Doc Chilton approached Rip, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He'd done what he could for the handful of other wounded settlers. "They're a sorry lot, Campbell." "They're what we've got," Rip said. "Can you shoot, Doc?" "I was a surgeon in the war," Chilton slurred slightly. "I'm better at patching holes than making them. But I can try." He patted a large caliber pistol tucked into his belt. "A man's got to try." Rip nodded. He walked to the head of the train, where Bram was already climbing into the driver's seat of the lead wagon, his left arm held stiffly at his side. "You sure you're able?" Rip asked. "This is my train," Bram said through gritted teeth. "I'll see it through or die driving it. You ride point. Tell me what you see." "I'll see Creed's men before they see us," Rip promised. He swung himself up onto Sandy's back. The mare shifted under him, sensing the tension, ready to move. Rip looked back down the line. He saw Clara lifting her daughter into their wagon, her movements gentle but firm. He saw Elias glaring at him, a study in fear and resentment. He saw Tommy, mission accomplished, a dozen canteens slung over his shoulder, looking at Rip with pure adoration. He saw the drawn, silent faces of the others, people whose names he didn't know, people who were putting their lives in his hands. This was it. The die was cast. The long, bloody race to Prospect Ridge had begun. "Move 'em out, Bram," Rip called, his voice carrying down the line. The wagon master cracked his whip over the backs of his mules. The sharp sound echoed across the river valley. A wheel groaned. Wood creaked against leather. Slowly, agonizingly, the lead wagon lurched forward, pulling itself from the mud and onto the trail. One by one, the others followed, a wounded serpent dragging its own tomb behind it. Rip turned Sandy's head and trotted out ahead, his rifle resting across his lap. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood. The shadows grew long, turning every rock and clump of sagebrush into a potential hiding place for a smiling killer. The hunt was on. Chapter 2. A collective shudder ran through the pioneers, a single organism of grief and fear. But O'Sullivan's orders, raw-edged and torn from his throat, were a splash of cold water. The weeping became muffled. The stunned paralysis gave way to a grim, mechanical movement. Men and women slid from the wagon beds into the river, their faces masks of misery, as they began the terrible work. Rip Campbell watched for only a moment, his jaw tight. He nudged Sandy's ribs, turning the mare away from the sorrowful tableau. There was a job to do, and it wasn't wrapping the dead. It was keeping the living from joining them. "I'll be back," he said to the air, though his eyes met the wide, watching gaze of the boy, Tommy, who nodded as if Rip had handed him a sacred oath. Rip put Sandy into a canter, riding a wide circle around the wagons, his eyes not on the pioneers but on the ground. One he rode to the far bank, where the attackers had vanished. The place stank of wet horses and something else, something sharp and sour. He dismounted, letting Sandy's reins trail. The mare wouldn't wander. The tracks were a mess, a churned-up scramble of a hasty retreat. But there was no art to it. No effort to hide their trail. A real war party, Comanche or Kiowa, would have ridden over rock, used every trick to melt back into the land. These men had just fled, Rip knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of a hoofprint. A heavy horse, shod with a thick iron shoe. Not the light, unshod ponies of the Plains tribes. He moved methodically through the brush. 20 feet from the riverbank, half hidden under a scrubby bush, was the first bottle. Too cheap whiskey, its label peeling. A few steps further, another. Indians prized firewater, but they didn't leave it behind. Then he saw the glint of brass. He picked up a shell casing, rolling it in his palm. 3 Winchester. Same as his own. Common enough. But as he scanned the ground, he found more, and among them, the heavier casings of a Springfield carbine. Military issue. Rip rose and walked to the crest of a small rise, the spot where the attack had likely been staged. Here, the signs were even clearer. Dozens of bootprints scarred the earth, the distinct heel and sole pattern of men on foot. 4 He saw a discarded cheroot, still damp. He crumbled it between his fingers. The tobacco was still fresh. This wasn't a raid. It was a military-style ambush executed by undisciplined men. Men playing dress-up. White men. He stood there, letting the pieces click into place. The shod horses, the whiskey, the bootprints, the false war cries. A cold knot formed in his stomach. This wasn't a random attack. This was a calculated act of terror, designed to look like something it wasn't. And that made it infinitely more dangerous. He swung back into the saddle and rode back toward the river, his face a granite mask. The scene at the ford was even more desolate up close. The pioneers had dragged their dead to the grassy bank. A tall, gaunt man with a nervous tic, Elias, the one who wouldn't meet his eye, was clumsily trying to rip a sheet of canvas. Nearby, the widow Clara held her daughter May close, shielding the child's eyes from the bodies of their neighbors. Rip dismounted and strode directly to Bram. The big man was leaning against a wagon wheel, his face pale. A balding man with whiskey on his breath and a surprisingly steady hand was cinching a bandage tight around Bram's bloody shoulder. "Doc Chilton," the man grunted. "Best I can do without my tools." Rip ignored him. He looked Bram square in the eye. They weren't Indians. Bram's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on Rip. "What are you talking about?" "I found their tracks," Rip said, his voice low and flat. "Bootprints all over the ridge. Left behind whiskey bottles and Springfield shell casings. Their horses were shod. This was white men, dressed up for a slaughter." 5. Doc Chilton froze. Elias stopped fumbling with the canvas. A hush fell over the small group. Bram stared at Rip, a new kind of dread dawning in his eyes, darker than the pain from his wound. He seemed to shrink, the bluster draining out of him. He let out a ragged breath. "Creed," he whispered, the name like a curse. "Creed?" Rip pressed. "The Creed gang," Bram said, his voice gaining a shaky strength. "We heard tell of them back at Fort Dodge. Said they were animals. Ex-Confederate, guerrillas who never quit the war." 6. Who leads them? Rip's question was sharp as a skinning knife. "A man named Silas Creed," Bram answered, his gaze dropping to the ground. "They call him Smiley." 7. The name was so absurd, so contrary to the bloody work they just witnessed, that it was utterly chilling. "They say he smiles while he kills. Says it's the only time he feels right with God." Rip digested this, the cold knot in his gut twisting tighter. This changed everything. A random Indian attack was a force of nature. This was personal. This was a sickness. Smiley Creed wasn't just a bandit, he was a man who enjoyed his work. And he wouldn't be scared off for long. "This ain't just a robbery then," Rip stated. "It's a hunt." "They wanted us to scatter," Bram said, looking at the bodies on the grass. "Wanted us panicked. Easier to pick us off, one by one." Rip looked from the determined set of Bram's jaw to the quiet strength in Clara's face as she comforted her daughter, to the raw fear in Elias's eyes. He saw Doc Chilton take a subtle pull from a flask. He saw young Tommy, now helping roll a body onto a sheet of canvas, his movements clumsy but resolute. This was his charge. A wagon train full of ghosts and frightened souls, led by a wounded man, hunted by a smiling killer. He had given them a choice, and they had chosen. Now he had to make his own. The road to Prospect Ridge had just become a long, open grave. He could still leave. No one had paid him. No one could stop him. He could ride away and let Smiley Creed have his fun. But he looked at Bram, who met his gaze, not pleading, but with the flat, dead-eyed look of a man facing his own end. He thought of the boot prints, the cheap deception, the sheer malice of it all. This wasn't just bad luck. It was an evil that needed answering. "All right, Bram," Rip said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "You're gonna get your people to Prospect Ridge." He paused, letting the wagon master hang on the unspoken clause. "Because I'm gonna ride with you." 8. A collective sigh of relief went through the settlers who had been listening. It wasn't loud, but it was palpable, a physical easing of tension. "Get your dead loaded," Rip commanded, his voice taking on a new authority. "We ride in 20 minutes. We don't stop for hell or high water." He turned, his gaze sweeping over all of them, the living and the dead. The graveyard would have to wait. Chapter 5. The trail narrowed. The open plains gave way to a broken, toothy landscape of rock and stunted juniper. The wagons, which had lumbered along with a semblance of space between them, were now forced into a tight, vulnerable column. The creak of axle grease and the clatter of mule hooves bounced off the rising canyon walls, sounding unnaturally loud in the dead afternoon air. Rip Campbell rode 50 yards ahead, a solitary rider swimming in a sea of stone. He hated this kind of country. It was ambush territory, a place where a man could die before he ever heard the shot. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, never stopped moving, scanning the high ridges, the dark shadows between boulders, the places where a rifle barrel might gleam. He had his Winchester out of its scabbard, resting easy across his thighs. Sandy felt the tension, her ears swiveling, her steps light and careful. He saw the pass ahead, a grim slash in the rock that the trail ran through. 2 towering pillars of stone stood on either side like rotten teeth, one of them leaning at an impossible angle. Widow's Rock, the place was called on Bram's map. A name that felt like a premonition. Rip reined in, raising a hand. Behind him, the lead wagon groaned to a halt. He could feel it in his bones, a cold prickle on the back of his neck. This was wrong. The air was too still. No birds. No lizards skittering on the hot rock. Just silence. He was about to wheel Sandy around, to tell Bram they were going to have to find another way, a long way around, when the world exploded. The first shot came from high on the right-hand ridge. It wasn't aimed at Rip, but at the lead wagon. The bullet, heavy caliber, punched a fist-sized hole through the canvas cover with a sound like a giant whip crack. A woman screamed. A mule brayed in terror. Then the silence was torn to shreds. Gunfire erupted from both sides of the pass, a deafening, echoing roar. Bullets ricocheted off the canyon walls with angry whines, splintering wagon beds and kicking up plumes of dust. It was a perfect crossfire. A killing box. "Down!" Rip bellowed, his voice swallowed by the din. "Get down and return fire." He spurred Sandy toward the meager cover of a rock slide near the trail's edge, swinging down from the saddle as he moved. He landed on his feet, rifle in hand, and pressed himself flat against the warm stone. Creed's men were well hidden, just flashes of muzzle smoke from the rocks above. They were firing at the wagons, at the animals, creating chaos. Rip saw Bram, roaring orders from his driver's seat, firing a pistol with his good arm. He saw Doc Chilton, surprisingly calm, helping a family out of their wagon and under its belly. He saw young Tommy, his face white but his hand steady, aiming a small rifle over a wagon wheel. Then he saw Elias Dunn. Clara's brother was crouched behind his wagon, his own rifle in his hands. But he wasn't firing. He was staring up at the ridges, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with a pure, paralyzing terror. "Done!" Rip yelled. "Lay some fire down on that ridge to your left. Keep their heads down." Elias didn't seem to hear him. He was locked in his own private hell. A shot from above slammed into the rock just inches from Rip's head, showering him with stone fragments. He flinched back, peering up. He saw the shooter, a bearded man in a filthy shirt, levering another round into his rifle, taking careful aim right at him. He was pinned. "Elias!" Rip's voice was a raw command. "Shoot, damn you!" The man on the ledge. "Now!" He saw Elias turn his head, saw his terrified eyes meet Rip's. For a heartbeat, there was a flicker of something, a struggle. The man's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He tried to raise it, but he couldn't. His arms wouldn't obey. He was frozen solid. The bearded man on the ledge grinned, settling the rifle stock against his shoulder, his finger tightening on the trigger. There was no time. Cursing, Rip kicked out with his boot, dislodging a large flat rock at his feet. He shoved it with all his strength, sending it skittering out from his cover. For a split second, the shooter's eyes flicked toward the movement. It was all Rip needed. He rolled out, bringing the Winchester to his shoulder in a single fluid motion. The rifle bucked against his collarbone. The bearded man on the ledge was thrown backward, a red flower blooming on his chest, his rifle clattering down the rock face. Before anyone could react, Rip levered another round and swung his aim to the other side of the canyon. He caught a glimpse of a dusty hat rising above a boulder. He fired again. The hat flew into the air as if kicked, and the unseen man behind it slumped out of sight. 2 men down in as many seconds. The volume of fire from the Creed gang faltered. They were bushwhackers, not soldiers. They thrived on surprise and terror, not a stand-up fight with a man who could shoot like that. A ragged volley answered him, but it was panicked, unaimed. Then silence. The ambush was over. The smell of gunsmoke, acrid and sharp, hung thick in the narrow pass. A mule lay dead in its traces, its legs tangled. Miraculously, no settlers were hit. Rip got to his feet, his face grim, and walked toward the wagons. He didn't look at the dead men on the rocks. He walked straight to Elias Dunn. The man was still crouched in the same spot, his rifle now lying on the ground beside him. He was shaking, a fine tremor running through his whole body. Rip stopped in front of him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, cold, and heavy as gravestones. "I told you to shoot." Elias looked up, his face a miserable mask of shame. I couldn't." "You froze," Rip said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You almost got me killed. You almost got your sister killed. Leave him be." Clara stepped between them, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She put a hand on Elias's shoulder, then turned to Rip. Her fear was gone, replaced by a raw, burning gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You saved us. Again." She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. It was a simple, fleeting touch, but it carried the weight of everything they had just survived. Rip didn't pull away. He looked from her face to her brother's. He saw the look Elias gave him. The man's shame was already curdling, twisting into something ugly. It was the resentful glare of a man who has been weighed, measured, and found wanting, not just by a stranger, but by his own sister. Rip gave a curt nod. He had seen that look before. It was more dangerous than a loaded gun. "Get that mule cut loose," he said to the air, turning away from them both. "We're moving. Now." The road ahead was long, and the enemies on the rocks were no longer the only ones he had to watch. Chapter 6. I don't reckon I've ever seen so many stars. The voice, coming from a young woman nursing a cup of chicory coffee, was soft in the immense silence of the plains. A small fire of buffalo chips and scavenged wood pushed a column of smoke into the boundless, ink-black sky, a lone beacon in a wilderness that felt as vast and empty as the heavens themselves. The wagons were drawn into a tight circle, a fragile wooden fortress against the prairie night and the unseen things that moved within it. For the first time since the river, a quiet, weary peace had settled over the pioneers. Rip sat apart from them, his back against a wagon wheel, the firelight catching the cold steel of the rifle resting across his knees. He watched the darkness, not the flames. Doc Chilton, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, let out a short, bitter laugh. There are just as many stars back east. You just can't see them. Too many city lights. Too much smoke. Too many people trying to outshine God. He took a long pull from the metal flask that never seemed to leave his side. You miss it, Doc? Asked Bram, his voice a low rumble. He sat with his back to a barrel, his wounded shoulder making him stiff and slow. Chilton considered the question, swirling the contents of his flask. I miss the man I was, he said, his words slightly blurred. Or the man I thought I was. I had a practice in Philadelphia. Brass sign on the door. A carriage. People called me Dr. Chilton, and they said it with respect. He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing ghosts in the flames. But a man's hands can shake for reasons other than age. And a man's judgment can be clouded by more than grief. I made a mistake. A boy died on my table who shouldn't have. He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air. They didn't take my knowledge. They didn't take my skill with a bone saw. They just took my name. My license. And they were right to do it. An uncomfortable quiet fell over the group. The confession was too naked, too raw for the fragile peace. It was Clara Bell who broke the spell. Her voice was steady, a clear thread of hope in the heavy tapestry of the night. My husband, Samuel, always said a person isn't defined by the place they leave, but by the one they're building, she said, looking not at Chilton, but at the faces around the fire. Her daughter May was asleep in her lap, her small face peaceful in the flickering light. That's what we're doing. We're building. Clara and I, Elias announced, his voice a little too loud as he tried to reclaim a place of importance, are partners. We have plans for a hotel in Prospect Ridge. The Dunn House. Clara smiled, a genuine warm expression that momentarily erased the weariness from her face. Elias is the businessman. He has a fine head for numbers and contracts. He'll cater to the miners and the ranchers, the people moving in to set up new lives. Her gaze softened as she looked at her brother, a deep well of familial loyalty in her eyes. And I'm going to run the kitchen. A real kitchen with a big cast iron stove. I'll make roast beef and fresh bread. Cinnamon rolls in the morning. A place where a tired man can get a hot meal and feel civilized again. A place where a family can feel safe. Her words painted a picture so vivid, so full of warmth and the scent of baking bread, that the weary pioneers could almost taste it. It was a dream of a future that felt 1,000 miles and 1,000 years away. They murmured in appreciation, their own hopes rekindled by the strength of hers. Through it all, Rip said nothing. He had listened to the tale of failure and the dream of hope, but his face remained an unreadable mask. The firelight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones, making him seem older, harder, a man apart from the circle of fragile humanity. Clara glanced his way once, a question in her eyes, an unspoken invitation to share a piece of himself. He gave only a slow, deliberate blink in return, his gaze already drifting back to the immense, star-dusted darkness that pressed in on all sides. Later, when the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and the camp was wrapped in the quiet breathing of exhausted sleep, a figure detached itself from the shadows. It was Elias. He moved with a false swagger, stopping a few feet from where Rip still sat, a silent sentinel. Campbell. Rip didn't turn his head, but his stillness was a form of attention. I saw the way my sister looks at you, Elias said, his voice a low, venomous hiss. And the way you look at her. I look at everything, Rip replied, his voice flat. It's my job. Her husband died less than a year ago, Elias continued, ignoring Rip's words. I promised him I would see her and the girl to safety. I am the head of her house. Her protector. He puffed out his chest, the words a desperate attempt to reclaim the authority he'd lost in the canyon. She is a good woman. A decent woman. She is not for a man like you. A drifter. A killer with no name and no future. Rip remained silent, his profile a stark silhouette against the dying embers. Whatever you think you're owed for what you did, you'll get it in coin when we reach Prospect Ridge, Elias pressed on, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. But Clara is not part of the payment. You will stay away from her. You will not speak to her unless it concerns the business of this train. Is that clear? The silence stretched taut and heavy. Elias stood his ground, waiting for an answer, for an acknowledgement of his threat. He received nothing. Slowly, deliberately, Rip rose to his feet. He did not look at Elias. He did not speak a word. He simply shouldered his rifle, turned his back on the smaller man, and walked away from the dying fire, his boots making no sound on the dusty earth as he moved toward the edge of the camp to dissolve into the vast waiting darkness of the first watch. Chapter 7. The dawn came cold and gray, promising a sun that had not yet shown its face. A hard wind scoured the plains, kicking up dust and making the canvas wagon covers snap and pop like pistol shots. After the shared confessions of the night, a new tension gripped the travelers. The brief respite was over. They were exposed again, a wounded centipede crawling across a landscape that wanted them dead. They had been moving for less than an hour when Rip, riding point, crested a small rise and pulled Sandy to a sudden sharp halt. The mare tossed her head, her nostrils flaring. The wind carried a new scent, overriding the clean smell of dust and sage. It was the acrid smell of smoke. Thick pine-fed smoke. Bram urged the lead wagon forward until he was alongside Rip. What is it? Rip didn't answer. He just pointed. Ahead of them, the trail curved around the base of a wide, flat-topped bluff that dominated the landscape. And the bluff was on fire. A wall of orange flame chewed its way along the ridge, devouring the dry pine and brush. A thick, roiling cloud of black and gray smoke billowed into the sky, a funeral pyre visible for 100 miles. The fire was directly in their path. To go around would take them days, leading them deep into a maze of treacherous rocky canyons. It's a roadblock, Bram said, his voice grim. It's a funnel, Rip corrected him, his eyes scanning the terrain not for a way through, but for the trap. He's not trying to stop us. He's trying to hurt us. Force us to take the low trail through that ravine. He gestured with his chin to a narrow, shadow-choked cut to the south. He'll have men waiting on the rimrock. Be like shooting fish in a barrel. Panic began to ripple down the wagon train, a murmur of fear that traveled from wagon to wagon. This felt different. It was a force of nature unleashed, biblical in its fury. We can't fight a fire, Elias Dunn yelled from his wagon, his voice cracking. We have to turn back. We turn back, we die, Rip snapped without looking at him. We go into that ravine, we die. There's only one move left. He swung down from Sandy's back, handing the reins to a wide-eyed Tommy. Keep them here. Don't move an inch until I get back. Where are you going? Bram demanded. Hunting, Rip said. He pulled his knife from its sheath, checking its edge, his movements economical and deadly. A fire like that needs tending. He moved away from the trail, vanishing into a gully. He moved with a speed and silence that was unnerving, using the contours of the land, the smoke-laced wind in his face. He was no longer a cowboy. He was a predator, closing on his prey. High on a distant ridge, Silas Creed lowered a brass spyglass from his eye. The unnatural smile etched on his face widened. He could see it all perfectly. The tiny wagons halted in confusion, the wall of beautiful cleansing fire, and the lone figure of the cowboy melting into the landscape. "He is magnificent," Smiley whispered, a genuine reverence in his tone. A hulking bandit next to him, a man named Cale, grunted. "He's just one man, Smiley." "A bee is just one bee, Cale," Smiley replied, raising the spyglass again. "But it has a sting. This one understands the board. He knows it's not the fire he has to fight. It's the hand that lit the match. Look at him. He moves like a wraith." He chuckled, a dry rasping sound. "I sent 2 of our boys to keep that fire hot. Let's see if they earn their keep." Rip smelled him before he saw him. The rank smell of stale sweat and cheap tobacco. The arsonist was hunkered down behind a rock outcropping, not 200 yards from the fire, his back to Rip. He was watching the wagon train, a rifle resting beside him, waiting for them to make their move toward the ravine. Rip slowed his approach, his boots making no sound on the gravelly soil. 10 yards. 5. The man was completely oblivious, captivated by the chaos he had helped create. Rip drew his knife. He did not want the sound of a gunshot to give away his position. He lunged forward, his left hand clamping over the man's mouth, stifling his shock cry, his right hand drawing the blade across the man's throat in a single brutal motion. The man convulsed once, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then went limp. Rip lowered him gently to the ground. He didn't pause. He scanned the area, picking up the second man's tracks. This one was further up the bluff, closer to the flames, pushing a pile of dead brush toward the fire line with a long pole. The heat was immense, a physical wave that shimmered in the air. The man was silhouetted against the flames, a dark demon feeding the inferno. Rip raised his Winchester. The distance was close to 100 yards, the target dancing in the heat haze. He rested the barrel on a rock to steady his aim, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was sharp, almost lost in the roar of the fire. The silhouetted figure flinched, dropped his pole, and staggered forward, clutching his chest. He took 2 stumbling steps, and then pitched headfirst into the edge of his own fire. Rip watched for a long moment, his face impassive. The immediate threat was gone. The fire would burn itself out, but it had been neutered as a tactic. He knew he was being watched. He could feel the eyes of the man with the spyglass on him, a cold weight between his shoulder blades. He turned and began the long walk back to the wagons, a solitary figure moving through a world of smoke and flame, having just answered one blasphemy with 2 of his own. Chapter 8. "Mister, can you fix her hair?" The voice was as small and timid as a field mouse. Rip, who was checking the cinch on Sandy's saddle, turned his head slowly. It was the little girl May, Clara's daughter. She stood a few feet away, holding up a rag doll with a mop of tangled yarn for hair. Her eyes, wide and serious, were fixed on him, a silent testament to a child's simple faith that a grown-up could fix anything. Rip stared at her for a long moment, his hands frozen on the saddle strap. He was a man accustomed to dealing with rustlers, storms, and killers. He had no language for this. "I'm not a barber, little one," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "But you can make rope," she insisted, taking a brave step closer. "Mama said so. She said, your hands are clever. Please?" Sally's hair is all snarled from the dust. He looked down at his own hands. They were calloused and scarred, The knuckles scraped raw from the fight at Widow's Rock. They knew the feel of a rope, the heft of a pistol, the unforgiving steel of a knife. The thought of using them to braid a doll's hair was so foreign it was almost laughable. He should have said no. He should have turned away and busied himself with 100 other tasks that needed doing. But he saw her mother Clara watching from the back of their wagon, a soft, weary hope in her expression. He saw the trust in the little girl's eyes, a trust so absolute it was a weight. With a sigh that seemed to come from the deepest part of him, he knelt, his joints cracking in protest. "All right," he grumbled. "Let's see the patient." May beamed and handed the doll over as if it were a sacred relic. Rip sat on an overturned bucket, the doll feeling absurdly small and fragile in his grasp. He fumbled with the tangled yarn, his thick fingers clumsy and slow. He tried to separate the strands, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was harder than tracking a man in broken country. It required a patience he rarely possessed. Clara approached quietly, carrying 2 tin cups of water. She handed one to him without a word, and sat on a nearby crate, her hands busy mending a tear in a small shirt. They sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft whisper of her needle through the cloth, and Rip's own frustrated muttering as he worked on the doll. "You're good with her," Clara said finally, her voice low. "I'm not good with her," Rip countered gruffly. "I don't know the first thing about children." He finally managed to work a particularly stubborn knot free from the yarn. "You don't frighten her," Clara clarified. "After everything she's seen, that's a gift. She sees what I see." "And what's that?" he asked, his eyes still on his task. "A man who does what needs to be done," she answered simply. "You carry a great deal of trouble, Mr. Campbell. But you carry it for other people." He didn't know how to answer that. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was charged, a fragile connection being woven in the air, as delicate as the yarn in his hands. He began to braid, his fingers slowly remembering a motion from a lifetime ago, a memory of his own foster mother teaching him to play a horse's tail. 3 strands, over and under, a simple repeating pattern. A small, neat braid began to take shape. He was so focused on the work, on the strange intimacy of the quiet moment, that he didn't see Elias approaching until his brother-in-law's shadow fell over them. "Clara, we need to repack the provisions." Elias's voice was sharp, cutting through the calm. His eyes were fixed on Rip, on the doll in his hands, and his face was a tight mask of displeasure. "It can wait a moment, Elias," Clara replied, her tone even. "No, it can't," he insisted. "We lost time because of the fire. We need to be ready to move." He looked at Rip with open contempt. "Surely you have better things to do, Campbell, than play with dolls. There's a perimeter to walk. Or have you forgotten the men who are hunting us?" Rip finished the braid and tied it off with a small piece of twine. He handed the doll, Sally, back to a delighted May, who scurried away with her newly coiffed patient. He rose to his feet slowly, his gaze locking with Elias's. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with bandits. "I don't forget anything," Rip said, his voice a low warning. "Elias, that's enough," Clara said, her voice rising now, a protective fire in her eyes. "The man was being kind to your niece." "He is not the man," Elias sneered. "He's a hired gun. A drifter. His kindness is an act. He's putting on a show to get close to you. Can't you see that? Have you no sense of propriety? Of loyalty to Samuel's memory?" The mention of her dead husband was a deliberate cruelty. Clara flinched as if struck, a flash of deep pain in her eyes. But it was followed instantly by a cold, gathering fury. She stood up, her slight frame seeming to grow in stature until she stood eye to eye with her brother. "Do not," she said, her voice trembling with rage, ever use my husband's memory as a weapon against me. Not you. Not ever. Samuel was a brave man. He would have been grateful to Mr. Campbell. He would have stood by his side, not cowered behind a wagon wheel. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving it pale and mottled. He opened his mouth to retort, but no sound came out. He was silenced, not by the drifter he hated, but by the sister he thought he controlled. Clara held his gaze for another long, hard second, her disgust and disappointment plain to see. Then, without another word, she turned her back on her brother, picked up her mending basket, and walked away with all the dignity of a queen. Chapter 9. What in the devil's name is that? Bram's voice was a low growl of disbelief, his good hand tightening on the wagon's brake lever. The train, which had been winding its way up a steep, narrow trail carved into the side of a mountain, ground to a halt. Ahead, the path twisted through a formation of jagged granite spires that climbers and cartographers had aptly named the Devil's Spine. And blocking the path, wedged between two of the largest spires, were two derelict wagons. They were positioned to create an impassable wall. But it was what was perched on top of them that made the blood run cold. Even from a distance, they could see the crude wooden crates stacked precariously, their sides stenciled with a stark black warning, "Dynamite." Wires snaked from the crates down the side of the wagons, disappearing into the rocks below. "It's a toll gate," Rip said, his voice flat. He reined Sandy in, his eyes not on the wagons, but on the high ridge overlooking the trail. He saw a glint of sunlight on metal. A spyglass. "And he's the collector." As if summoned by the words, a figure appeared on the ridge. Small, wiry, and unmistakable even at this distance. Silas Smiley Creed stood in plain sight watching them, his hands clasped behind his back like a man enjoying a pleasant afternoon stroll. He wasn't hiding. He was presiding. "He's got us boxed in," Bram said, the despair in his voice as raw as his wound. "There's no way around. A cliff on one side, a sheer drop on the other. He blows that dynamite, he'll bring the whole mountain down on us." "That's what he wants us to think," Rip said, his mind racing. He was calculating angles, distances, possibilities. "He wants us to panic. To freeze. It's another game." "This doesn't feel like a game." Elias shouted from his wagon, his voice high and strained. "He'll kill us all." Rip ignored him. He tore a strip of white cloth from a discarded flour sack. Tying it to the barrel of his Winchester, he urged Sandy forward. "What are you doing?" Bram demanded. "Going to negotiate the price," Rip said over his shoulder. He rode slowly up the trail, the white flag fluttering, a stark symbol of truce in a place that offered none. He stopped about 70 yards from the dynamite rig blockade. He could see Smiley more clearly now, could almost make out the fixed, terrible smile on his face. He saw other men, Creed's gang, moving among the rocks, their rifles ready. "Creed!" Rip's voice rang out, clear and steady in the mountain air. For a long moment, there was no reply. Then Smiley's amplified voice drifted down from the ridge, thin and reedy. "You honor me with a visit, Cowboy. Have you come to surrender your flock?" "I've come to give you a choice, Creed." Rip shouted back, pitching his voice to carry. "You can take your men and ride out of here now. Or you can stay and die." A ripple of mocking laughter echoed from the rocks. Smiley, however, just tilted his head, as if genuinely curious. "A bold offer. On what authority do you make it?" This was it. The bluff had to be perfect. On the authority of 2 troops of United States cavalry, out of Fort Bellamy. Rip yelled, putting every ounce of conviction he had into the lie. "Their captain sent me ahead. They're no more than 5 miles behind me. They'll be here in 20 minutes. They have a warrant for you, Creed. For murder and treason." They have orders to see you hang." The laughter from the rocks died. There was a nervous shifting. Even from this distance, Rip could sense their uncertainty. Fort Bellamy was close enough for the story to be true. Smiley, however, remained perfectly still. He raised his spyglass again, not looking down the trail behind Rip, but at Rip himself. "Cavalry, you say? A whole 2 troops? My. And they sent a lone drifter in a dusty hat as their advance scout. Not a uniformed sergeant? Not a man with a bugle? That seems inefficient, even for our esteemed military." The trap in his words was plain. Rip's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of stone. "They sent the man who knows your face," he countered. "They sent the man who won't lose you in these rocks." Smiley lowered the spyglass, and a slow, deliberate clap echoed down the canyon. It was the sound of a predator applauding its prey's cleverness just before the kill. "Brilliant!" Smiley's voice called out, dripping with theatrical admiration. "A beautiful lie. So bold, so simple. You almost made me believe. You almost made my men believe." He paused. "But I know men, Cowboy. I know them better than I know my own prayers. A man with 2 troops of cavalry at his back does not ride under a white flag. He rides under a banner of guns and death. You, my friend, are well and truly alone." Smiley had called the bluff. The game was over. A cold certainty settled over Rip. There was no more talking. No more maneuvering. Only the grim arithmetic of survival. His eyes darted from the stacked crates of dynamite to the rock face behind them. It was fractured, unstable, a wall of loose scree and precariously balanced boulders held in place by little more than gravity and habit. "Last chance, Cowboy." Smiley's voice boomed. "Throw down your gun. We'll take the woman and the supplies. We might even let the rest of you crawl away." Rip didn't answer. He slowly, deliberately, untied the white cloth from his rifle barrel and let it drop to the dust. He raised the Winchester, the stock fitting into the familiar hollow of his shoulder. His target wasn't a man. It wasn't the dynamite itself. A direct hit might set it all off at once, burying everyone. His target was smaller, more precise. It was a single heavy powder keg sitting right beside the dynamite crates, its black staved side a perfect bullseye. Smiley saw the rifle rise, and he laughed, a genuine delighted laugh that echoed through the canyon. "Fool! You think you can outshoot my whole gang?" Rip's world narrowed to the front sight of his rifle, the dark circle of the powder keg, and the space between. He let out a slow breath, his finger tightening on the trigger as he swung the barrel slightly, aiming not for the center of the keg, but for the base of the unstable cliff face just behind it. He squeezed. The rifle roared, and almost instantly the powder keg erupted in a massive concussive blast of white smoke and orange flame. The explosion didn't just detonate, it shoved. A titanic force slammed into the fractured cliff. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, the mountain began to move. Boulders the size of wagons broke free, and a tidal wave of rock, dirt, and stone plunged down toward the trail, aimed directly at the blockade. Rip spurred Sandy, spinning her around and digging in his heels as the world began to come apart at the seams. Chapter 10. "Doc. Over here. For God's sake, we need you." The cry cut through the dust-choked twilight. The rock slide Rip had triggered had saved them from Creed's guns, but it had exacted a price. The thunderous avalanche had sealed the pass behind them, but the shock of it had sent horses rearing, pioneers scrambling, and one wagon perilously close to the cliff's edge. Now, in the bruised purple light of dusk, they had made a crude camp in the shadow of their own deliverance, and were counting the cost. Lanterns were lit, casting long dancing shadows that turned the familiar faces of the pioneers into grotesque masks of fear and exhaustion. Doc Chilton moved among them, a grim angel in a stained coat. The flask was gone, tucked away. In its place was a leather satchel of tools and a look of fierce, sober concentration. "Clara, I need more clean water," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear as he knelt beside a man with a shattered leg, the bone a white splinter jutting through his trousers. "And rip those sheets. I need splints and bandages. Now." Clara was at his side in an instant, her face pale but her hands steady, a silent, efficient partner in his grim work. Rip stood apart, watching the chaotic ballet of aid and comfort from the darkness. His work was done, for now. He had checked the perimeter, finding no immediate tracks. The rockslide had made them a temporary island in the sky, safe for the night but trapped come morning. He walked the edge of the camp, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his mind already working on the problem of tomorrow. It was a sound that drew his attention, a muffled, rhythmic sob, almost lost beneath the groans of the injured and the murmur of the wind. It came from the far side of the camp, behind the last wagon, the one that still carried the dead. He moved toward it, his step silent. He found Elias Dunn huddled on the ground, his back pressed against a cold wagon wheel, trying to shrink into the shadows. A half-empty bottle of whiskey was clutched in his hand. He was weeping. Not the loud, performative grief of a man seeking sympathy, but the broken, silent tears of a man utterly hollowed out by his own failure. Rip didn't speak. He just stood there, a tall, dark shape in the gloom. Elias didn't seem to notice him at first. Then a hitch in his breathing, a sudden stillness. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and bleary in the faint moonlight, and saw Rip. A flash of his old, resentful anger crossed his face, but it died as quickly as it came, leaving only a vast, empty landscape of despair. "Go away," Elias croaked, his voice thick. Rip didn't move. A bitter, ragged laugh escaped Elias's lips. "Of course. You wouldn't. The great Rip Campbell. Come to watch the coward cry into his bottle." He took a long, shuddering drink of whiskey. "Well, have your fill." Rip remained silent, a granite statue of patience. His silence was more unnerving than any question could have been. It was a void that Elias, in his misery, felt compelled to fill. "She was beautiful," Elias whispered, his gaze turning inward, staring at a ghost only he could see. "My Mary. She had hair like spun cornsilk and a laugh that, it sounded like bluebells in the spring." He shook his head, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "We had a small farm back in Illinois. Wasn't much. But it was ours. Then the fever came. Took her in 3 days. 3 days. And I just watched. I held her hand while the life went out of her. I couldn't do anything. Just watch her go." He stared down at his own hands, as if they were alien things. "I am good at watching people die, Campbell. It seems to be my only real talent." He looked up at Rip, his eyes pleading for something, scorn, pity, anything but this unnerving calm. When her husband, Samuel, decided to bring Clara and the girl out here, he was already sick. The consumption had him. We all knew it. The night before he died, he made me promise. He grabbed my hand, and he looked right into my soul. "Protect them, Elias," he said. "You're all they have. Be the man I can't be. Promise me." Elias's voice broke. "I promised him. I swore on my wife's grave. I would be their rock. Their protector." He gestured wildly with the bottle, sloshing whiskey onto the ground. "And what have I been? A coward. A fool." I froze. "You know it. Clara knows it. I saw her face today. She looks at me and she sees nothing. A hollow man." The confession poured out of him, a torrent of shame and grief held back for too long. "And then there's you," he finally hissed, his focus returning to Rip, his pain twisting back into its familiar shape of resentment. "You ride out of the sun like some avenging angel. You don't talk, you don't smile. You just kill. You just fix everything. You fix it all without even trying." He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly, and took a step closer to Rip, jabbing a finger toward him. "You think I don't see you, cowboy? You think I don't see the way she looks at you? You are everything I promised I would be. Everything I'm not." He choked on the words. "And I hate you for it." Rip looked at the broken man before him, at the raw, agonizing truth of his pain. He understood it all now. The bluster, the fear, the pathetic attempts at authority. It was all the frantic scrabbling of a man drowning under the weight of a promise he was too weak to keep. He took a step back, giving the man his space. "A promise is a heavy thing," Rip said, his voice quiet but carrying the hardness of stone. "Best not to drop it." Without another word, Rip turned his back on the weeping man and the ghosts that haunted him. He walked away from the confession, his own burdens not eased but clarified. He continued his slow, circular patrol of the camp, a lone guardian walking the edge of a small, flickering island of life in a vast and unforgiving darkness. Chapter 11. Is that one of ours? The question came from a gaunt-faced farmer named Miller, his voice raspy with dust. He pointed a long, bony finger up the trail. The wagon train, which had been crawling under the oppressive afternoon sun, slowed to a ragged halt. In the middle of the trail, perhaps 200 yards ahead, lay the still dark shape of a mule. It lay on its side, its legs splayed at an unnatural angle, a small sad island in a sea of baked earth. "Could have thrown a shoe and broke a leg," Bram suggested from his driver's seat, though his voice lacked conviction. He squinted, his hand shading his eyes. "Or the heat got to it." "We should see," Clara said from the wagon behind him, her voice laced with concern. "If it's suffering." Rip was already moving. He urged Sandy into a slow walk, leaving the wagons behind, his body a study in relaxed alertness. Every instinct he had was screaming. The scene was wrong. It was too quiet, too neat. A dead animal on the plains was an event. It drew a crowd. Coyotes would be slinking in the gullies. Vultures would be circling, dark specks patient in the vast empty sky. But here, there was nothing. The sky was a clean, merciless blue. The air, aside from the taste of dust, was clean too. Too clean. He got closer. The mule was one of theirs. He recognized the brand on its flank. It wasn't bloated, so it hadn't been dead long. But there were no visible wounds. No sign of a struggle. Its eyes were open, glazed with a strange milky film. And there were no flies. Not a single one crawling on its open eyes or its lolling tongue. Then he smelled it. Faint, almost imperceptible on the hot breeze, a sickly sweet scent like bitter almonds. Poison. His eyes lifted from the dead animal, scanning the landscape with a new, lethal intensity. The trail was flanked on both sides by low rocky outcrops, a jumble of sun-bleached boulders and thorny brush. Perfect cover. He saw the scuff marks in the dirt at the base of the rocks, signs of men settling in, getting comfortable. He saw a patch of earth that was darker than the rest, where a man had likely relieved himself while he waited. This was Smiley Creed's handiwork. It had the man's signature stench of cruel theatrics. He hadn't just set an ambush, he'd baited it with a poisoned animal, relying on the pioneers' decency, on their concern for a suffering creature, to draw them into his killing box. Rip turned Sandy in a slow, casual circle, as if just surveying the trail ahead. He let his gaze sweep over the rocks, marking the most likely hiding places. 3 men on the left. 2 on the right. A classic L-shaped ambush. They would let the lead wagons pass the mule, and then open up, catching the whole train in a devastating crossfire. He rode back to the wagons, his face an unreadable mask. The pioneers watched him approach, their faces etched with anxious questions. "Is it dead?" Tommy asked, his young face full of pity for the animal. "It's dead," Rip confirmed. He dismounted, walking to Bram's wagon, moving with a calm deliberation that belied the urgency screaming in his veins. He spoke in a low voice, meant only for Bram, but the pioneers nearby strained to listen. "It's a trap, Bram. The mule's been poisoned. There are 5 men in those rocks. 3 on the left, 2 on the right. They're waiting for us to get bunched up beside it." Bram's face went pale under his sunburnt skin. He looked from Rip to the still form of the mule, then to the silent, waiting rocks. "What do we do?" he whispered. Rip's gaze swept over the settlers. He saw Clara, her hand resting protectively on May's head. He saw Doc Chilton, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. He saw the farmer Miller, clutching an old shotgun. And he saw Elias, his face a mess of fear but also something else, a desperate desire not to fail again. They were sheep, yes, but even sheep can bite when cornered and led by a wolf. "We spring it," Rip said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "On our terms." He moved from wagon to wagon, his instructions soft but sharp as steel. "Miller, you and your boys aim for that patch of shadow on the left. Don't shoot at a man. Shoot at the shadow. Chilton, you see the 2 boulders that look like a split skull. Aim between them. Elias," he paused, locking eyes with the man, "the high ground on the right. There's a single man behind that flat rock. He's yours." He gave each man, each person holding a rifle, a specific target. Not a person, but a location. "I'm going to ride ahead. They'll be watching me. Bram, you keep the wagons rolling, slow and steady. When the lead wagon is even with the mule, I'll raise my hand. That's the signal. You'll shout now. Not before. You fire 1 shot. 1. All at the same time. Then you reload, and you wait." A terrifying, silent understanding passed through the small group. This wasn't a defense. This was a counter-ambush. He was trusting them. He was trusting their lives to their own aim. Rip mounted Sandy. He trotted forward, alone, drawing the eyes of every hidden rifleman. He saw the wagon start to roll behind him, a slow, creaking funeral procession. The air was thick with a silence that was louder than any cannon. He could feel the ambushers' anticipation, their fingers tightening on their triggers. The lead wagon drew even with the dead mule. Rip's hand went up. Bram's voice, a raw primal roar, shattered the silence. "Now." The world answered with a single, deafening clap of thunder. A ragged but unified volley erupted from the line of wagons. It wasn't a series of panicked pops, it was one cohesive, shocking blast. Smoke billowed, momentarily obscuring the scene. From the rocks on the left came a scream of shock and pain. A man stood up from behind a boulder, clutching his chest, a look of utter disbelief on his face, before toppling forward. Another man broke cover, scrambling away in a panicked crab walk. On the right, Elias's target, a rifle clattered from the high ground. The ambush was broken before it had even begun. The surviving Creed gang members, who had been expecting to slaughter panicked settlers, were themselves thrown into chaos, fleeing from a volley of death that had come from nowhere. Rip didn't watch them run. He sat on his horse, the smoke swirling around him, his ears ringing from the blast. He looked back at the line of wagons, at the pale, stunned faces of the pioneers, at the wisps of smoke rising from a dozen rifle barrels. They hadn't just survived. They had fought. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the man with the spyglass. He knew Smiley was out there, watching. Watching his trap get sprung, watching his wolves get scattered by a flock of sheep. He swung his gaze back to the settlers, his face hard and unyielding. "Reload," he commanded, his voice cutting through the sudden ringing silence. Chapter 12. A person could get the notion you don't like being thanked, Mr. Campbell. Clara's voice was a soft counterpoint to the crackle of the low-burning fire. Rip didn't turn from where he stood just outside the circle of light, watching the vast silent prairie. The victory that afternoon had left a strange quiet in its wake. The pioneers were exhausted, but for the first time, a sliver of pride moved among them. They had fought back. They had won. "Nothing to thank me for," Rip said, his voice a low rumble. "I gave an order. They followed it. The plan worked." "The plan worked because they trust you," Clara corrected him gently. She stepped closer, leaving the relative safety of the firelight to stand near him in the deep shadows that fringed the camp. "Because I trust you." He finally turned to look at her. In the faint starlight, her face was soft, her eyes holding a depth that seemed to draw him in. The hardships of the trail had stripped away any pretense, leaving a core of strength and sincerity that was as beautiful as it was rare. "Trust is a dangerous thing to place in a man like me," he said. "Is it?" she challenged softly. "The man who braids a child's dull hair, who stands against a dozen guns for strangers. What kind of man is that, exactly?" A long silence settled between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the prairie grass. He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping the dark horizon as if searching for an enemy, for any distraction from the question. "Why won't you settle down, Rip?" she asked, her use of his first name a quiet intimacy. "A man with your skills could have any ranch he wanted. You could build something. A home. A life." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I am better at tearing things down." "I don't believe that," she insisted. "No one is just one thing." He looked at her again, and something in her steady, unwavering gaze seemed to unlatch a door inside him he usually kept bolted shut. The words came slowly, rough and unused, like tools brought up from the bottom of a long neglected chest. "I had my cowboy days," he began, his voice dropping lower. "Rode the Chisholm Trail, pushed longhorns from Texas to Kansas, until the sight of a cow made my eyes ache. It was a hard life, but it was simple. You had the herd, the trail, the sky. Nothing else mattered." He paused, his eyes unfocused, looking back into a past he never spoke of. "But it's a young man's game. And when it's over, you find yourself with nothing but saddle sores and a taste for cheap whiskey. You drift. You look for work. You keep moving because you're afraid of what you'll find if you stand still." He kicked at a loose stone, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet night. "All that time on the trail, all that time staring at the horizon, you're not just chasing the herd. You're hunting for something. You tell yourself it's just the next town, the next job. But it's not." He finally met her eyes, and the raw honesty in his was startling. "It's something else. Something you can't put a name to. A feeling that you're not whole. That there's a piece of you missing, waiting up ahead, just around the next bend, over the next hill. So you keep riding. Hunting for something you don't even know how to find." The confession hung in the air between them, a thing of rare and fragile beauty. He had given her a piece of himself, a truth he had likely never spoken aloud to another living soul. She saw the profound loneliness in him, the restless spirit of a man at war with his own emptiness. Impulsively, she closed the small distance between them, her hand coming up to rest on his arm. The muscle beneath her fingers was hard as iron. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, "it's not something you find by hunting. Maybe it's something you build." His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips. The world seemed to fall away. There was no wagon train, no sleeping pioneers, no threat of Silas Creed hiding in the darkness. There was only the vast, starry sky above and the warmth of her hand on his arm, the scent of wood smoke and sage in the air. He was no longer a drifter, no longer a killer. He was just a man, standing before a woman who saw through the calloused exterior to the fractured soul beneath. He leaned in slowly, his head dipping toward hers. He saw her eyes flutter closed, her lips part slightly in anticipation. The moment was stretched taut, a breath held before a plunge. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. He could end the hunt right here, right now. He could stop running. But then, a flicker of movement in the firelight behind her caught his eye. It was Elias, watching them from across the camp, his face a mask of pure, venomous hatred. The image was a splash of icy water. The drifter. The killer. A man who brought death in his wake. What right did he have to steal a moment of peace? What right did he have to bring his storm into her harbor? He straightened up abruptly, pulling his arm from her grasp. The moment shattered, the pieces falling around them like broken glass. Clara's eyes opened, filled with confusion and a flash of hurt. I have to check on the horses, he lied, his voice once again rough and distant. He turned his back on her, before he could see the full extent of the pain he had caused. He strode away from her, away from the fire, his long strides eating up the ground as he moved toward the picket line, seeking the familiar, uncomplicated company of horses and the cold comfort of the dark. Chapter 13. Hold up. In God's name, hold up. The shout, thin and frantic, came from the driver of the third wagon. A sharp, ugly crack had echoed through the ravine, a sound like a giant bone snapping. The wagon it came from lurched violently, tilting at a drunken angle, as the rear wheel on the driver's side splintered apart, the spokes collapsing inward. The heavy wagon box slumped onto its axle, digging into the hard, rocky earth with a groan of tortured wood. The entire wagon train ground to a halt. They were in the worst possible place to be stranded, a deep, narrow ravine with sheer rock walls that baked in the midday sun, offering no shade and no escape routes. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down and reflecting off the pale stone until the air shimmered. Rip rode back from his point position, his face a grim mask. He dismounted, kneeling to inspect the damage. The wheel was a ruin, the hub cracked and the iron rim bent into a useless shape. It wasn't a simple repair, it was a reconstruction. Can it be fixed? Bram asked, climbing down from his own wagon and favoring his wounded shoulder. His face, already etched with worry, seemed to carve itself into deeper lines. Anything can be fixed given time, Rip answered, his gaze sweeping the high canyon rims. And time is the one thing we don't have. We've a spare wheel, Bram said, a faint hope in his voice. But getting the axle jacked up, it'll take every able-bodied man. The work began. It was a slow, grueling battle against gravity, heat, and their own exhaustion. Under Bram's direction, the men unloaded the stricken wagon, piling its precious contents, sacks of beans, bolts of cloth, a woman's treasured hope chest, onto the dusty ground. They worked with a quiet, desperate urgency, their shirts quickly soaked with sweat, their faces streaked with grime. Rip didn't help directly with the labor. He stood guard, his rifle never leaving his hands, his eyes constantly scanning the rocks above. He moved from one end of the halted train to the other, a restless, watchful predator. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer. An hour passed, then another. They managed to lever the axle up with posts and sheer muscle, blocking it in place. The spare wheel was rolled out, heavy and cumbersome. As they struggled to fit it, their focus narrowed to the single, all-consuming task. The ravine, the heat, the ever-present threat of Silas Creed, it all faded into the background, secondary to the immediate, physical problem of wood and iron. It was Clara who noticed it first. She had been organizing the women, rationing water, her quiet strength a binding force. Her gaze happened to drift to the rear of the wagon train, to the last wagon in their sad procession. The death wagon. A small frown touched her lips. Something was wrong. The wagon seemed alone. The wagon just ahead of it, the miller's wagon, was there. But the mules that had been pulling the death wagon were gone. And the wagon itself seemed to be further away than it should be, near a turn in the ravine. "Rip," she called out, her voice calm but with a new sharp edge of alarm. "The last wagon." He turned, his eyes following her pointing finger. He saw what she saw. A cold dread, heavier and more profound than any fear of ambush, settled in his gut. He broke into a run, his boots pounding on the hard-packed earth, weaving past the other wagons. He reached the miller's wagon and saw the truth. The traces that had connected their wagon to the mule team of the death wagon had been cut, sliced clean through with a sharp knife. Rip ran on, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rounded the bend in the ravine, just in time to see the last of it. Two of Creed's men, moving with a stealthy, practiced haste, were leading the mule team that pulled the death wagon into a narrow side canyon, a mere slit in the rock wall he hadn't even noticed before. They didn't look back. They simply melted into the shadows of the rock and were gone. They hadn't fired a shot. They hadn't made a sound. While the pioneers were completely absorbed in their work, Smiley's men had performed a quiet, surgical amputation. By the time Rip returned to the group, the news had already spread, a ripple of pure horror that left them stunned and silent. The broken wheel was forgotten. "He took them?" a woman whispered, her voice trembling. "He took our dead." This was not a raid for supplies. This was not a fight for dominance. This was an act of profound, spiritual violation. It was an attack on memory, on dignity, on the very rights that separated men from beasts. To leave the dead unburied was a curse. To have them stolen was a damnation. It was psychological warfare, of the cruelest kind. "This is a sign," Elias mumbled, his face ashen. "He's a devil. A devil sent to torment us. We are lost." Rip strode into their midst, his face thunderous. The fury radiating from him was a palpable force, a heat that was hotter than the sun. He had been outmaneuvered. While he had been watching for a frontal assault, Creed had struck from behind, not at their bodies but at their souls. "He wanted to break you," Rip said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through their despair. "He wanted to make you feel helpless. To make you believe that nothing, not even your own dead, is safe from him." He looked around at their shattered faces, at the tears of grief and rage. He wanted to send a message. Rip paused, his eyes as cold and hard as obsidian chips. He walked over to Sandy, pulling the rifle from its scabbard and checking the action with a definitive, metallic click. "Now I'm going to send one back." He turned his gaze on the pioneers, not with pity, but with a fire of command that burned away their fear. His vow was a quiet, deadly promise whispered into the hot, dead air of the ravine. "I am getting them back." He walked over to where young Tommy stood, the boy's face a mixture of terror and awe. Rip looked down at him, his expression grim. "Can you ride, boy?" he asked, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Can you ride quiet?" Chapter 14. "You cannot take the boy." The words were spoken by Clara, her voice a low, fierce command that cut through the stunned silence of the ravine. She stepped in front of Tommy, placing herself between the boy and Rip as if to shield him from a physical blow. "He is a child. I will not have you lead him into a nest of vipers." Bram echoed the sentiment, his face a thunderous mask of disapproval. "She's right, Rip. Find another way. This is a job for men, not for boys playing at being men." Rip's gaze, hard and unyielding as the rock around them, did not waver from Tommy. He ignored the adults, speaking directly to the boy, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "I asked you a question, son. Can you ride quiet?" Tommy looked from Rip's stony face to Clara's pleading one, then to Bram's stern disapproval. A war raged in his young eyes. But the awe he held for the man who had single-handedly saved them time and again won out over the fear. He took a deep breath, puffed out his skinny chest, and stepped out from behind Clara. "I can," Tommy said, his voice trembling only slightly. "I can ride as quiet as a ghost." Rip gave a single, curt nod. "Then you're the man for the job." He finally turned to the protesting adults. "Look at him," he said, his voice flat. "He's small. He can move through shadows that would swallow me whole. Creed's men are looking for a threat. They're looking for me. They won't be looking for a boy. I need someone to handle the mules while I clear the way. He's the only one who can do it without being seen." His logic was brutal and inescapable. He wasn't asking for a soldier, he was asking for a shadow. The argument died in Clara's throat, replaced by a cold dread. An hour later, under the thin silver light of a rising moon, they set out. Rip had given Tommy a spare pistol, an old Navy Colt, heavy and cold in the boy's hand. "You don't fire this unless your life depends on it," Rip had instructed. "It's loud. It's a last resort. Your job is the knife. Cut the picket rope for the mules. Cut them free. That's all. Then you get them moving." They rode without speaking, two phantoms moving through a world of black and silver. Rip led the way on Sandy, with Tommy following on a quiet, sure-footed pony. They entered the narrow side canyon where the death wagon had vanished. The air grew still and close, the silence so profound that Tommy could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. They dismounted 100 yards from the mouth of the canyon, tethering their mounts in a thicket of juniper. From there, they moved on foot. Rip moved like smoke, a part of the darkness itself. Tommy did his best to imitate him, stepping where he stepped, breathing when he breathed. They peered around a final boulder and saw them. The camp was little more than a filthy hollow around a low-burning fire. 4 of Creed's men were visible. 2 were passed out, empty bottles beside them. A third sat staring into the fire, his rifle across his lap. A 4th stood guard near the canyon entrance, a hulking bearded man who paced back and forth, his shape restless against the moonlight. And there, parked to one side like a grotesque trophy, was the death wagon. The mules were tied to a long picket rope nearby, their heads drooping with exhaustion. Rip put a hand on Tommy's shoulder, his grip firm. He pointed. First at the guard, then at the man by the fire. Then he pointed to the picket rope. Tommy nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The plan was clear. Rip would take the guards. Tommy's only job was the rope. Rip pulled the long, heavy blade of his fighting knife from its sheath. He handed Tommy his own smaller, skinning knife. "For the rope," he whispered, his breath warm against Tommy's ear. "Now." Rip vanished. Tommy blinked, and the space beside him was empty. He saw a shadow detach itself from another shadow near the canyon wall. He saw the pacing guard stop, his head cocked as if he'd heard something. The guard turned, and Rip was there. There was no sound, just a swift, brutal motion, an arm around the throat, the upward thrust of the knife. The guard went down in a heap, his death a silent exhalation of breath. Tommy knew it was his turn. His heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of his chest. He scurried forward, keeping low, a small gray lizard against the gray rock. The man by the fire hadn't moved. The 2 sleeping men snored on. He reached the picket rope, the rough hemp biting into his palm. He began to saw at it with the skinning knife, the blade sharp, the fibers parting with a soft, rasping sound. Suddenly, one of the sleeping men grunted, rolling over. He sat up, blinking blearily, his eyes adjusting to the dark. He saw the empty spot where the guard was supposed to be. He saw the small figure of Tommy, sawing frantically at the rope. "Hey," the man croaked, his voice thick with sleep. "What in the—" He never finished the thought. From the darkness, Rip's rifle cracked once, the sound an immense echoing thunderclap in the confined space. The man by the fire was thrown backward, as if kicked by a horse. The man who had just woken up scrambled for his pistol, but before he could draw it, Tommy gave one last desperate slash, and the rope fell away. "Go!" Rip roared. Tommy didn't hesitate. He leapt for the lead mule, grabbing its halter and pulling, screaming at the animals. "Yeah! Get up! Yeah!" The mules, panicked by the gunshot, surged into motion. The fourth outlaw was on his feet now, firing his pistol wildly into the darkness. A bullet whined past Tommy's ear, striking the rock beside him with a vicious crack. A sharp, hot pain lanced across his cheek as a splinter of rock flew off and cut him. He cried out more from shock than pain, but he didn't let go of the mule. The death wagon lurched forward, its wheels bouncing and crashing over the rocky ground. Rip was already in the saddle of the driver's seat, grabbing the reins Tommy had thrown to him. "Get on!" he yelled. Tommy scrambled up beside him as Rip cracked the whip over the mules' backs. The wagon rocketed out of the small camp and into the narrow canyon, a careening, out-of-control vessel of wood and death. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them as they made their harrowing moonlit ride back toward the main ravine, leaving the chaos of the ruined camp behind them. They reached the main body of the wagon train, to the stunned, relieved cries of the pioneers. Clara ran to Tommy, her face a mess of tears and relief, pulling him into an embrace. Rip swung down from the driver's seat, his face grim. He saw the cut on Tommy's cheek, a thin, clean line of blood welling up in the lantern light. The boy had earned his scar. He walked to his saddle, untying the spare hat he kept rolled in his slicker. It was worn, stained with the sweat and dust of a dozen cattle drives, but it was a good hat. He walked back to Tommy. "You did good, boy," he said, his voice gruff. "You did real good." He placed the hat on Tommy's head. It was too big, falling down over his eyes. Rip reached out and tilted it back, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then, as if embarrassed by the uncharacteristic display, he turned and walked away to stare out into the night, a silent guardian watching over the dead they had just reclaimed. Chapter 15. They can't go on. Bram's words were a statement of fact, not a complaint. He sat slumped on his wagon seat, his face the color of old ash, staring at the pathetic line of his wagon train. They had stopped in the middle of the open, sun-blasted prairie, the animals with their heads hung so low their muzzles brushed the dust, their sides heaving. The people were no better. They sat in the thin, useless shade of their wagons, a collection of wax figures melting in the heat, their eyes vacant with a soul-deep exhaustion. Rip rode Sandy back down the line, his own face grim. The air was thick with the dust of their passage and the palpable scent of despair. "The map says we're 5 miles from Prospect Ridge, Bram. We can't stop here. We're sitting ducks." 5 miles might as well be the moon," Bram grated out, gesturing with his good arm. "Look at them, Rip. We got the dead back, but it cost us what little we had left. The fight's gone out of them." It was true. The adrenaline of the midnight raid had long since worn off, leaving behind a profound and dangerous lethargy. A woman was weeping quietly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A man sat staring at his own blistered hands, as if they belonged to a stranger. Even Tommy, proudly wearing Rip's oversized hat, looked small and fragile, the scar on his cheek a stark reminder of how close they were to the edge. Rip surveyed the scene, his jaw tight. He saw Clara trying to comfort the weeping woman, her own face a mask of weary compassion. He saw Elias sitting apart, staring into the distance, a man who had retreated so far into himself he was practically a ghost. This was the most dangerous moment yet. More dangerous than the river ambush, the burning bluff, or the standoff at Devil's Spine. Creed's guns could only kill their bodies. This bone-deep weariness, this surrender of the spirit, this could kill their souls. It was a poison for which there was no antidote but pain. He dismounted, letting Sandy's reins drop. He walked into the center of the pathetic encampment, his boots scuffing the dust, until he stood where they could all see him. He waited, his silence a command. One by one, their dull eyes lifted to meet his. "I heard a woman crying," he began, his voice not loud, but carrying with a cold, clear resonance that cut through the heat. "I see men staring at the dirt, like they're hoping to find a grave to crawl into. You look like you're already beaten. You look like you're already dead." His words were stones thrown into a stagnant pond. Ripples of shock and resentment crossed their faces. "You've been shot at, burned out, and hunted," he continued, his voice relentless. "You've seen your friends and family killed. You fought to get your dead back from the animals that stole them." He paused, letting the memory of their small victories surface before he crushed them. "And now you want to quit. 5 miles from a town with a real graveyard. You want to give up and let them rot in that wagon right here, under this sun after all that." He fixed his gaze on the farmer, Miller. "You, Miller. Your wife is in that last wagon. You fought for her. You fired your rifle and stood your ground. Are you going to quit on her now? Let her final resting place be this patch of dirt?" He moved his gaze to Clara, though his words were for all of them. "You talk about building things. Hotels and kitchens. You can't build a damn thing if you're dead. You can't start a new life if you let the old one drown you in the dust a few miles from the shore." "We're not like you, Campbell," Elias suddenly spoke up, his voice thin and reedy. "We're not killers. We're farmers. We're tired." Rip rounded on him, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "I am exactly like you," he snarled, taking a step toward Elias, who visibly shrank back. "I get tired. I get thirsty. I bleed. The only difference between you and me is that I know a hard truth you people have been trying to outrun since you left Missouri. The world doesn't care if you're tired." He turned back to the rest of them, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. "Your pain doesn't matter. Your grief is a luxury you can't afford. Out here, there is only moving and not moving. There is only living and dying. That's it. There's no third choice. There's no resting. There's no catching your breath. Creed is out there. You think he's tired? You think he's quitting? He's hunting. And right now, you look like a herd of injured deer, waiting for the wolf to come and finish the job." He let the brutal silence hang in the air. He saw defiance flicker in some eyes, shame in others. He saw the first sparks of anger. Good. Anger was a fuel. "You think Prospect Ridge is some promised land where all this goes away? It's not. It's just a town. A collection of buildings filled with people who are just as scared and tired as you are. The only safety you're going to find is the safety you make for yourselves. The only strength you have is the strength you dig out of your own guts." He took a deep breath, his final words falling on them like a hammer blow. "I don't care if your feet are bleeding. I don't care if your hearts are broken. You will get up. You will get your animals on their feet. You will get these wagons moving. Prospect Ridge is 5 miles away." He looked from one face to the next, his gaze a physical force. "You got one more day in you. You damn well better." For a long moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then a small figure pushed himself to his feet. It was Tommy. His face was grim, set in a miniature version of Rip's own expression. He walked to the mule team of his family's wagon and began to check the harnesses. His small act of defiance broke the spell. Bram rose, groaning with the effort, and moved to his own wagon. Then Miller. Then another. A quiet, grim determination replaced the lethargic despair. They didn't speak. They just moved. They helped each other, their movements slow and painful, but they were the movements of the living, not the dying. Rip watched them, his face unreadable. He had given them the only thing he had to give. Not comfort, not hope, but the hard, ugly truth. He walked back to Sandy, swung himself into the saddle, and without a backward glance, spurred his horse into a trot, heading out to take the point once more. A solitary rider leading a ragged, resurrected army toward the last 5 miles of their journey. Chapter 16. Is that it? My God, is that it? The cry came from the widow Miller, her voice a raw, broken thing full of a desperate, disbelieving hope. She stood on the seat of her wagon, her hand shielding her eyes, pointing a trembling finger toward the horizon. Following her gaze, they saw it. At first, it was just a smudge against the vast, bruised sky of late afternoon, a collection of dark shapes huddled at the foot of the mountains. But as the weary mules trudged onward, the shapes resolved themselves. It was a town. Roofs, walls, the faint, geometric promise of civilization. Prospect Ridge. A ragged, spontaneous cheer went up from the pioneers. Men wept openly, hugging their wives. Children who had been silent for days shouted with glee. The sight of it, the simple fact of its existence, was a powerful tonic. It was the end of the trail, the end of the running. It was sanctuary. Rip Campbell, riding point, felt none of their elation. He saw the town not as a sanctuary, but as a tactician would. He saw a settlement, sprawled in a wide, open basin, with no natural defenses. He saw a long, straight main street that a company of riders could sweep through in a matter of minutes. He saw a collection of buildings that would burn as easily as the bluff Creed had set ablaze. As they drew closer, the pioneers' hopeful cheers died in their throats, replaced by a stunned, uneasy silence. From a distance, Prospect Ridge had been a promise. Up close, it was a disappointment. The main street was a river of mud and filth. The buildings were unpainted, raw wood structures with sagging porches and cheap false fronts. A few curious faces appeared in saloon doorways and behind dusty windows, their expressions not welcoming, but sullen and wary, the look of people who have learned that strangers bring only trouble. The wagon train, this battered, blood-soaked testament to survival, crawled to a halt in the center of the miserable town. The death wagon, with its sacred, terrible cargo, sat under the afternoon sun, an object of morbid curiosity to the locals. "Find the law," Rip said to Bram, his voice low. "Find the sheriff. Tell him what's coming." Bram, his face a mask of grim determination, slid down from his wagon. He approached a man leaning in a doorway, a portly fellow with a greasy apron and a sour expression. "Where can I find the sheriff?" Bram asked. The man grunted, wiping his hands on his apron. "You can't. Sheriff Tanner took a bullet to the gut in a card game a month back. He's planted up on the hill." He gestured with his thumb toward the small, sad graveyard overlooking the town. "No one's been in a hurry to take his place." "Then who's in charge?" Bram demanded, his patience fraying. "That'd be Mayor Abernathy," the man said, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "He's likely in his office." Which is to say, the back table of the saloon across the street. Rip followed Bram into the saloon. The place smelled of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. A few hard-faced miners sat at a table, their eyes following Rip's every move. In the back, just as the man had said, sat Mayor Abernathy. He was a small man with a florid face, watery eyes, and a fine tremor in his hands. An open bottle of whiskey and a half-empty glass sat before him. "Mayor Abernathy," Bram began. The mayor looked up, his eyes struggling to focus. "That's me. What do you want?" "If it's about the assay office fees, they're set by the Territorial Council, and there's not a thing I can." "It's not about fees," Bram cut him off, his voice sharp. "We have a problem. My wagon train was attacked. We've been pursued for days by a gang of outlaws led by a man named Silas Creed." At the mention of the name, the miners at the other table stopped their conversation. A sudden tense silence fell over the saloon. "Creed?" Abernathy whispered, the color draining from his already pale face. "Smiley Creed is out there?" "He is," Graham confirmed. "And he'll be coming here. This town is his next target. We need you to gather every man you have. We need to fortify the town. We need to make a stand." The mayor stared at him, then let out a weak, sputtering laugh. "Make a stand? With what? A handful of miners with rock dust in their lungs, and a town drunk for a mayor. Son, there is no law here. There's no authority. There's just us. People trying to dig a living out of the dirt." He picked up his glass, his hand shaking so badly that whiskey sloshed onto the table. "If Smiley Creed rides into this town, we will hide, we will pray, and we will give him whatever he wants. That is how we will survive." Rip had heard enough. He had fulfilled his promise. He had brought them to Prospect Ridge. He could turn around, walk out of this saloon, mount his horse, and ride away. This wasn't his town. These weren't his people. He could be 20 miles away by sunrise, the memory of these poor souls fading with the dust of his trail. It was the drifter's way. The smart way. But he saw Clara's face in his mind's eye, her hope for a new life. He saw Tommy, a boy who had earned a man's hat. He saw Bram, a good man broken by a bad trail. He knew with a cold, gut-wrenching certainty that Abernathy was right. They would hide, and Creed would drag them out. They would pray, and Creed would laugh. They would give him everything, and he would kill them anyway for the sheer joy of it. With a sigh that carried the weight of a dozen lives, Rip stepped forward. The choice was made. Or perhaps it had been made for him long ago, back at the river when he had first chosen not to ride away. "You're wrong, Mayor," Rip said, his voice cutting through the pathetic silence. Abernathy and Bram both turned to look at him. "That's not how you'll survive. It's how you'll die." He walked to the mayor's table, picked up the man's half-full bottle of whiskey, and set it firmly on the bar, out of his reach. He then swept a pile of dusty papers from the table, clearing a space. His reluctance was a bitter taste in his mouth, the feeling of a free man walking deliberately into a cage. But there was no other way. He looked at Bram, then at the stunned, frightened face of Mayor Abernathy. "Get me a list," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that had been absent from this town for far too long. "A list of every man, woman, and boy in this town who can hold a rifle. And then you'll show me where you keep your mining supplies. All of them." Chapter 17. "It wasn't there an hour ago. I swear on my mother's grave it wasn't there." The words, spoken by a jittery liveryman named Peters, sliced through the thin morning air. Rip stood before the town's main gate, a flimsy affair of raw timber that served as more of a suggestion than a barrier. A small crowd had gathered: Bram, Clara, a few of the braver townsfolk, and a very sober and pale Mayor Abernathy. In the center of the gate, driven deep into the wood with a gleaming bowie knife, was a piece of paper. It was a page torn from a Bible, the neat columns of Levitical law serving as a canvas for a scrawled, looping script written in charcoal. The contrast was a deliberate, mocking blasphemy. Rip pulled the knife from the wood, the blade singing as it came free. He held the paper, its edges fluttering in the morning breeze. He read the words aloud, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, which only served to amplify their horror. "To the good God-fearing sheep of Prospect Ridge," he began. "It has come to my attention that you are harboring a wolf, a stray who has forgotten his nature. This is an impurity, an imbalance in the natural order of things, which, as you know, is God's own holy work. I am a humble servant of that order, and I have come to correct it. You have one choice. It is a gift of mercy I am not required to offer. Send the man you call Campbell out to me, unarmed. Send him out to the graveyard on the hill, where he might contemplate the wages of his sin. Do this, and I will be satisfied. My flock and I will pass you by, and your town of dust and disappointment may continue its slow decay in peace. Refuse, and you will learn the meaning of a true and righteous reaping. I will come down from the hills, and I will burn your homes, I will salt your wells, and I will hang every man, woman, and child from the rafters of your saloon, as a testament to your foolishness. I have given you a shepherd. His name is Silas Creed. The paper trembled slightly in Rip's hand. He looked at the bottom. It was not signed with a name, but with a small, crude drawing of a smiling face. A terrible, suffocating silence fell over the crowd. This was worse than an attack. It was a judgment. It gave them a choice, and the choice was a poison. They could sacrifice one man, a stranger, a drifter, for the lives of the many. Mayor Abernathy was the first to break, his voice a pathetic, wheezing whisper. It's a simple choice. A logical one. One life for the entire town. He looked around, his watery eyes pleading for agreement. He's not one of us. We owe him nothing. We can pay him, of course, for his trouble. Pay him? Bram's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He took a step toward the mayor, his big frame radiating a fury that made Abernathy flinch back. Pay the man who rode through fire for us? The man who brought our dead home? You would hand him over to that devil on the hill like a sack of grain. It is the only sensible course of action. Abernathy cried, his voice rising in panic. He's drawing a line. Give him the man he wants, and the line goes away. The crowd murmured, their fear pulling them in two directions. The miners, the shopkeepers, they looked from Abernathy's pleading face to Rip's stony one. Rip was their only hope of defense, but he was also the magnet, drawing the lightning strike down upon them. He's right, a miner with a cough-rack voice said. We got families. Why should we die for him? Clara stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a righteous fire. Because he was willing to die for you, she shot back, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the murmurs. He didn't ask if we were from his town when he rode into that river. He didn't ask our names before he faced down Creed's guns. He saw people in need, and he acted. If you hand him over, you are not saving this town. You are damning its soul. Elias stood beside his sister, his face a turbulent storm of conflict. He looked at Rip, at the man he had hated with such a passion, the man who now stood as the single pivot point for all their lives. He opened his mouth, and for a moment, they all expected the coward's plea. Instead, what came out was a quiet, shaky but firm statement. She's right. We don't run. Not anymore. Rip listened to it all, the debate over his life, as if he were a bystander. He saw the fear, the shame, the flickering sparks of courage. He had brought this trouble to their door. But he also knew, with absolute certainty, that he was their only way through it. He folded the piece of paper, the blasphemous ultimatum, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Then he looked at the assembled crowd, his gaze moving from face to face, holding each one for a brief, intense moment. He gives us a choice, Rip said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the emotional turmoil. But it's a false one. A trick. You hand me over, you show him you're weak. You show him your sheep. And a wolf never passes by a pen of sheep. He'll take me, and then he'll come down here, and he'll take everything else anyway, just for the sport of it. He looked up at the sun, judging its height in the sky. He wants an answer. Rip's eyes swept back over the crowd, hard and commanding. We'll give him one. He walked over to Mayor Abernathy, who looked as if he might faint. You wanted to pay me, Mayor. Here's my price. You will go to every house, every tent, every hovel in this town. You will tell them the choice isn't whether or not to fight for me, The choice is whether they want to die on their knees in the dark or on their feet in the sun. That is the only choice Creed has truly given us." He turned away from the trembling mayor and faced the others, his voice taking on the sharp, clear edge of a field commander. The time for debate was over. The time for work had begun. "Bram," he ordered, his voice sharp. "Take 5 of your men. Find every barrel, every crate, every piece of heavy lumber you can. We're barricading the north and south ends of this street. I want them head high and twice as thick." He pointed at the liveryman, Peters. "Round up every horse. Get them into the corral. One of Creed's first moves will be to try and scatter them, to keep us from running." His gaze fell on Miller and the other hard rock miners. "Get me every pickaxe and shovel you have. And I want to see those mining supplies. The dynamite. Every last stick." He looked up at the hills that surrounded them, at the unseen eyes he knew were watching. "Smiley gave us a deadline," he said, his voice dropping so only those nearest could hear. Then he raised it again for all to hear, a clear, defiant challenge hurled at the silent, watching hills. "We have until dusk." Chapter 18. I ain't no soldier. I've only ever shot at rabbits and the occasional coyote. The man was a cooper, his hand soft and clumsy on the stock of the heavy Spencer rifle Rip had thrust at him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear that was close to paralysis. Rip didn't soften his gaze. "The men coming for this town are worse than coyotes," he said, his voice hard as iron. "And they see you as rabbits. Today that changes. You aim for the biggest part of them, and you keep pulling the trigger until your gun is empty or they stop moving. That's all you need to know." He pushed the rifle more firmly into the man's chest. "Now get up on that roof." The man, swallowing hard, scurried to obey. The scene was repeating itself all over Prospect Ridge. The town had become a frantic hive of preparation, a desperate race against the setting sun. Under Rip's relentless command, the sullen apathy of the morning had been burned away, replaced by the grim, focused energy of people fighting for their lives. Barricades of overturned wagons, ore carts, and heavy furniture now blocked the north and south ends of the main street. The flimsy town was being transformed, tooth and nail, into a fortress. Men who had only ever wielded a pickaxe were now learning the heft of a rifle. Women who had only known the work of a kitchen were now posted as lookouts, their eyes scanning the hills. Amid the organized chaos of armed defense, another kind of battle was being waged. Clara had taken over the saloon, not as a den of vice, but as the town's heart. She had organized the women, and soon the smell of boiling coffee and a rich, simmering stew cut through the air, a defiant scent of life and community against the metallic tang of fear. She moved through the preparations, a cup of coffee for a man reinforcing a barricade, a piece of bread for a woman tending to a crying child, her presence a quiet, steadying force that was as vital as any of Rip's commands. Rip saw Elias, his face smudged with dirt, and for a moment expected a complaint. Instead, he saw the man directing a team of settlers and miners with a surprising efficiency. He wasn't holding a gun, he was holding a list. "The rooftops on the east side have ammunition," Elias reported to Rip, his voice strained but clear. "But the west side is running low on rifle cartridges. I can move some from the general store, but it'll leave the men at the barricade short if they need more." Rip looked at him, a flicker of reassessment in his eyes. The man wasn't a fighter, but he had a mind for logistics. "Take what you need," Rip said. "Tell the men at the barricade to make every shot count." Elias nodded, a new, unfamiliar resolve in his eyes, and hurried off to complete his task. He had found his place in the battle, not as a warrior, but as a quartermaster, and in doing so, had finally begun to step up. Rip's attention was drawn to young Tommy. The boy was no longer trailing him like a shadow. He stood near the main barricade, his expression deadly serious. He had forsaken his small rifle. In his hands, he now held a greener shotgun, its barrels cut short, a brutal-looking weapon of last resort. It was the gun that had belonged to the farmer who had died at the river ford in what felt like a lifetime ago. Rip saw the boy check the breech, his movements slow and deliberate, mimicking the ones he had seen Rip make 100 times. He was no longer a boy playing at being a man. He was a soldier, armed with a dead man's gun, ready to make a stand for his own life. The sun bled lower in the sky, painting the clouds in violent hues of orange and purple. The final, most important preparations were underway. Rip worked with a trio of grizzled Irish miners, their expertise not in guns, but in the earth-shattering power of dynamite. In the cellar of the assayer's office, they worked by lantern light, their hands surprisingly delicate. "The blasting caps are old," one of the miners, a man named Finney, warned, his brogue thick. "And this wire is frayed. It's a fickle beast, dynamite." "It just has to work once," Rip said, his focus absolute as he helped crimp a cap onto a fuse. They planted the charges themselves. 2 sticks tucked into a loose joint at the base of the main barricade, a tripwire hidden in the dust. Another, larger charge was buried in the middle of the street, halfway down, with a wire running all the way back to the saloon roof. It was Rip's answer to a cavalry charge, a hidden volcano sleeping beneath the mud. These were the traps, the deadly surprises for a man who believed he held all the cards. As the last light faded, a hush fell over Prospect Ridge. The work was done. The stew had been eaten, the ammunition distributed. The town was a coiled snake waiting. Every window held a rifle. Every rooftop had a defender. Every shadow was a potential grave. Rip climbed the ladder to the roof of the general store, the highest point in town, offering a clear view of the entire street and the dark, silent hills beyond. He lay flat on the pitched roof, the rough shingles biting into his elbows. He settled the stock of his Winchester against his shoulder, the familiar weight a cold comfort. Down below, he could see the others in their positions. He saw Clara in a second-story window of the hotel she had dreamed of building, a pistol in her hand. He saw Tommy at the edge of the barricade, the big shotgun resting on a barrel. He saw Elias directing a final runner into position. The sky turned from purple to a deep star-flecked black. The wind whispered down the empty street, carrying the scent of pine and the cold promise of violence. There was nothing left to do now but wait for the devil to come calling. Rip stared out into the darkness, his eyes searching the hills he knew held Silas Creed and his men. He slowly, deliberately, chambered around, the metallic shick-shack of the lever action, a final sharp promise in the vast waiting twilight. Chapter 19. Riders. God Almighty, there are riders coming from the hills. The lookout's cry was a raw scream of terror that sliced through the twilight hush. A moment later, they all heard it, a low, rumbling thunder that was not in the sky but on the earth. It grew steadily, the sound of 100 hooves pounding the hard-pan dirt, a drumbeat signaling the end of the world. From his vantage point on the roof of the general store, Rip saw them crest the northern ridge. They were not a disorganized rabble, they were a wave of dark horsemen, a cavalry charge from hell, with Silas Creed at their head, a pale specter on a white horse. "Hold your fire!" Rip's voice rang out over the street, a sharp command against the rising tide of panic. "Wait for the trap! Wait for my shot!" The charge came on, a terrifying, unstoppable force. They came with wild, triumphant yells, firing their pistols into the air, expecting the flimsy barricade to splinter, expecting the town to cower. They swept down the main street, a torrent of violence and noise. The lead riders were 20 yards from the barricade when a horse's hoof snagged the thin, almost invisible tripwire. The world erupted in a cataclysm of fire and thunder. The dynamite charge Rip had planted at the base of the barricade detonated with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of wood, dirt, and shrapnel into the oncoming charge. Horses screamed, their bodies torn apart. Men were thrown from their saddles, their triumphant yells turning into shrieks of agony. The front rank of the charge dissolved into a tangled, burning heap of death and confusion. "Now!" Rip bellowed. His rifle was the first to speak, its sharp crack a signal to the hidden defenders. An instant later, Prospect Ridge answered. A ragged but furious volley of gunfire erupted from every window, every rooftop, every sheltered doorway. The wide-open street became a killing field. Creed's men, their charge broken and their wits scattered by the explosion, were caught in a brutal crossfire. Riders slumped from their saddles. Horses, maddened with fear and pain, bolted, trampling the fallen in their frenzy. The town, to Rip's grim satisfaction, was holding. The farmers and miners, terrified but resolute, were firing and reloading as he had taught them. They were no longer sheep. They were a cornered animal that had found its teeth. From his perch, Rip was a specter of death. His rifle barked with methodical precision, each shot finding a target. He took down a man trying to rally the others, then another trying to set fire to a building. His mind was a cold machine, calculating, prioritizing, controlling the chaos. He saw Smiley Creed, who had pulled his white horse back from the initial blast, his face a mask of incandescent rage. The smile was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure disbelief. This was not the easy slaughter he had envisioned. His game had been turned against him. He screamed orders, trying to regain control, but his men were pinned down, taking fire from a dozen different angles. Then Creed's eyes lifted, scanning the rooftops, searching for the architect of his frustration. His gaze met Rip's. For a long second, across the deadly space of the street, the two men locked eyes. Creed pointed a finger directly at Rip, a silent, personal declaration of war. Leaving his horse, Smiley and three of his toughest men darted for cover, fighting their way toward the general store, intent on getting to the man on the roof. Rip saw them coming. He fired, dropping one of the men, but the others were too fast, using the chaos for cover. They were inside a building across the street now, preparing to assault his position. It was then that Tommy made his move. From his spot at the barricade, the boy saw it all. He saw the direct threat to Rip, the man he idolized. He saw Smiley Creed, the devil himself, preparing to attack his hero's position. Fear and loyalty warred in the boy's heart, and a desperate, heroic bravery won out. He rose from behind his cover, the big greener shotgun seeming to tremble in his small hands. He rested the barrels on the barricade, his cheek pressed to the stock, his eyes sighting down the length of the weapon. He was taking aim at Silas Creed. "Smiley!" the boy yelled, his voice a high, reedy cry of defiance. Creed, about to burst from a doorway, froze. He turned, his eyes landing on the small figure at the barricade. A flicker of surprise, then amusement crossed his face. He raised his pistol with the unhurried grace of a snake striking. He was faster. The two guns roared at almost the same instant. The boy's desperate blast of buckshot tore splinters from the doorframe beside Creed. Creed's single, deliberate shot did not miss. Tommy was thrown backward, as if by an invisible hand, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. The oversized hat Rip had given him flew from his head and landed in the dust. From the rooftop, Rip saw the hat fall. He saw the boy's small body go limp. A sound escaped Rip's own throat, a raw animal noise of pure anguish. The cold machine in his mind shattered, flooded by a white-hot, all-consuming rage. The battle for the town was forgotten. The strategy, the traps, the defense, it all turned to ash in his mouth. There was only one thing left in the world. He scrambled down the ladder from the roof, landing hard on the balcony below. He didn't hesitate. launching himself over the railing and dropping 15 feet to the street, landing in a crouch. He came up running, his rifle in one hand, his Colt in the other. He saw Smiley Creed, his face alight with a fresh victory, turning to make his escape as the tide of the battle soured for his gang. Creed! Rip's roar was the sound of damnation. He chased him through the chaos, firing as he ran, his bullets chewing up the ground around Smiley's feet. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader in retreat and their numbers dwindling, began to break and run, fleeing back into the darkness. Rip didn't care. He vaulted the smoldering barricade, his eyes fixed on the single figure of the man on the white horse. He grabbed the reins of a nearby, riderless horse, swinging into the saddle in a single, fluid motion. He spurred the horse into a gallop, launching it out of the town and into the night, a man no longer defending anything, but a pure instrument of vengeance, hunting a single smiling soul in the vast waiting darkness. Chapter 20. Is that all the fury you have, cowboy? Smiley Creed's voice, a taunting, joyous cry, drifted back through the moonlit darkness. I took your boy. I snuffed him out like a cheap candle. I expected more fire from you. Rip didn't answer. There were no words in him. There was only a cold, white-hot engine of rage propelling him forward, his borrowed horse stretched out in a desperate, lung-bursting gallop. The sounds of the battle in Prospect Ridge faded behind him, replaced by the thunder of his own horse's hooves and the frantic beating of his own heart. The chase was short and brutal. Smiley wasn't trying to escape. He was leading Rip, drawing him away from the town, up the low hill that overlooked it, up to the town's small, lonely graveyard. Smiley's white horse leapt a low stone wall, landing amongst the leaning headstones and crude wooden crosses. Rip followed, his own mount clearing the wall with a grunt of effort. The graveyard was a stark, silent place, the moonlight washing the markers in a ghostly silver light. An open grave, freshly dug for one of the bottle's first victims, gaped like a wound in the earth. This was the place. Smiley reined in his horse, turning to face Rip, a triumphant, almost ecstatic grin plastered on his face. Here we are, he announced, spreading his arms wide as if to welcome an old friend. A fine place for a final prayer, don't you think? Rip launched himself from the saddle before his horse had even come to a full stop. He landed on the ground, his rifle coming up, but Smiley was already firing. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Rip's shoulder, a fiery, blinding pain that spun him around. His rifle clattered to the ground. Another shot from Smiley's pistol struck Rip's horse, and the animal went down with a terrible high-pitched scream, pinning Rip's leg beneath its weight. Smiley laughed, a sound of pure unholy delight. He swung down from his own horse, holstering his pistol. He drew the long, gleaming Bowie knife that had pinned his ultimatum to the gate. Guns are so impersonal, he said, stalking toward the trapped and wounded Rip. So distant. I find a blade, or better yet one's own hands, to be a much more intimate way of understanding a man's soul. He was 10 feet away when Rip, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, wrenched his leg free from under his dead horse. He came up, his own pistol lost in the fall, armed with nothing but the rage that had carried him here. He met Smiley's charge head-on. The fight was not a duel. It was a primal, ugly brawl amongst the dead. Rip's fist connected with Smiley's jaw, the crack of bone sharp in the night air. Smiley grunted, stumbling back, but his grin never wavered. He lunged, and the knife sliced through Rip's coat, drawing a hot line of fire across his ribs. They crashed into a leaning headstone, the old rock crumbling under their weight. They rolled on the ground, a tangled mess of limbs and fury. Rip's hands found Smiley's throat, squeezing, trying to crush the life from him. Smiley, gasping, brought the knife up, stabbing wildly, driving the blade into Rip's thigh. Pain, brilliant and white, exploded in Rip's leg. His grip faltered, and Smiley squirmed free. They both staggered to their feet, circling each other, breathing in ragged, painful gasps. Smiley was bleeding from his mouth, ripped from his shoulder, ribs, and thigh. "Yes," Smiley hissed, his eyes glittering with a feverish excitement. "This is it. This is the truth of us. Not your laws, not your mercy. Just this. Tooth and claw. The wolf and the wolf." He lunged again. Rip, anticipating the move, sidestepped and brought his elbow down hard on Smiley's knife arm. The bone snapped with a wet crunch. The knife fell to the dirt. Smiley cried out, a sound of pure agony, but the grin remained, a grotesque bloody mask. Rip didn't give him time to recover. He drove his fists into Smiley's gut, then his face, blow after brutal blow. He was no longer a man. He was vengeance personified, every punch a payment for the boy in the oversized hat. They fell to the ground again, this time with Rip on top. He pinned Smiley's broken arm with his knee and rained down punches, his knuckles splitting, his fury a bottomless well. Smiley made no move to defend himself. He just lay there taking the punishment, his bloody, broken face turned up to the moon, that terrible grin still fixed in place. "See?" Smiley choked out through a mouthful of blood, his voice a bubbling whisper. "I knew it was in you. I knew you were one of mine." Rip's fist stopped in midair. He stared down at the man, at the pathetic, evil thing beneath him. He saw the truth. Killing him like this, with his bare hands, was giving him the victory he craved. It was proving his twisted philosophy right. With a final guttural roar of disgust, Rip pushed himself off. He scooped up Smiley's fallen knife. He hauled the broken man to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his own body. He dragged him across the hallowed ground, past the graves of honest men and women, until he stood at the edge of the open waiting grave. He held Smiley up, forcing the man to look down into the black, empty rectangle. "This is where you belong," Rip grated out. Smiley looked from the grave back to Rip, his one good eye alight with a strange final piece. "Thank you," he whispered. And he smiled. Rip didn't hesitate. He drove the Bowie knife, Smiley's own blade, deep into the man's heart. He held him for a moment, as the last shudder of life went out of him, that awful grin still frozen on his face, a final defiant mockery. Then, with a grunt of effort, Rip shoved the body forward. It tumbled into the open grave, landing with a soft final thud on the cool earth below. He did not watch it fall. He stood there, swaying on his feet, bleeding from a half-dozen wounds, the knife still clutched in his hand. The sounds of the fight in the town had died down. A profound silence settled over the graveyard, broken only by Rip's own ragged breathing. He had won. He had avenged the boy. But all he felt was a vast, cold emptiness. He stared down at his own bloody hands, then at the dark hole in the ground that held his enemy. With a shudder that racked his entire body, he dropped the knife to the dirt, turned his back on the open grave, and walked away into the darkness. Chapter 21. It's time. Let's bring our people home. Bram's voice, rough with grief and exhaustion, carried across the battered town in the clean, quiet air of the new morning. The sun was rising, its golden light spilling over the eastern hills, illuminating a scene of brutal aftermath. The main street of Prospect Ridge was a ruin, littered with the debris of the battle, splintered wood, brass shell casings, and the dark, still forms of Creed's fallen men. The living moved through the wreckage like ghosts, their faces smudged with gunpowder and disbelief, their victory tasting like ash in their mouths. They had won. But the cost was written on every face, in every slow, pained movement. From the makeshift infirmary in the saloon, Doc Chilton, his sleeves rolled up and his face a grim mask of concentration, continued his work. He had not slept. He had not had a drink. He was simply a surgeon again, fighting a desperate rearguard action against death. He had patched Rip's wounds, the deep knife thrust in his thigh, the gash across his ribs, the bullet graze on his shoulder, with a craftsman's skill, his hands steady and sure. Rip stood apart from it all, leaning heavily against the support post of the general store's porch. Every breath was a fresh discovery of pain. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the hollowed-out ache in his soul. He watched as the pioneers, aided by the humbled, grateful townsfolk, began the solemn work. They brought the death wagon, its canvas sides scarred and splintered from the final, harrowing ride, to the center of the street. With a reverence that had been denied them for so long, they began to unload their dead. The bodies from the river. The men who had fallen at Widow's Rock. And the fresh casualties from the night's terrible battle. 2 miners and a boy in an oversized hat. The procession up the hill to the graveyard was slow and silent. There were no tears now, only a profound and weary sorrow. Men who had been enemies just days before now walked side by side, sharing the burden of a crude pine coffin. Bram and Elias, his face cleansed of its resentful fear, and now showing only a quiet, deep-set grief, helped carry the small light box that held Tommy. Rip did not join them. He remained below, a solitary figure watching them ascend the hill. He told himself it was the wounds that kept him there, that the climb would be too much. But he knew it was a lie. He was an outsider, the architect of their victory and the cause of their pain. He was the storm that had passed, and he had no place among the quiet rebuilding. He felt the townsfolk's gratitude like a brand, and the pioneers' respect like a weight. But all he could feel was the hollow space where a boy's life used to be. From his vantage point, he watched the funeral. He could not hear the words, only the low murmur of a prayer spoken by Bram. He saw the small canvas-wrapped bundles and the rough wooden boxes being lowered into the earth. He saw the townsfolk and the pioneers shoveling dirt side by side, their shared loss bridging the gap between stranger and neighbor. He saw Clara holding May's hand, her back straight and her head held high, a study in quiet, unbreakable dignity. He saw them filling the last grave, the one that held Tommy. They placed a simple wooden cross at its head, and someone, he thought it was Clara, laid Tommy's shotgun, the dead man's gun, across the fresh mound of earth. He watched until the service was over, until the small crowd began to disperse, their solemn procession now heading back down the hill to the town, to the living, to the hard work of what came next. The question of what came next for him hung in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone. His job was done. The threat was ended. He had fulfilled his promise, and then some. He was a free man. Free to collect his pay, mount his horse, and ride away into the hazy distance, back to the drifting life he knew. He could feel the pull of it, the familiar call of the open trail, and the blessed anonymity of being a stranger. No responsibility. No connections. No one to disappoint. No more boys to get killed. He still had not said what he was doing. He had not spoken a word to anyone since the fight. He had accepted Doc Chilton's stitching in silence, had taken a plate of food from Clara with only a grim nod. His silence was a wall, and no one knew if he was building it to keep the world out or to keep himself in. The graveyard was empty now, save for the new graves and their crude markers. Rip pushed himself off the porch post, the pain in his leg and shoulder a sharp, insistent reminder of the night's work. He began the slow, arduous walk up the hill, each step a negotiation with his own wounded body. He walked through the gate and stood among the graves, the final resting place he had unwittingly led these people to. His gaze passed over the resting places of men and women he'd never known, coming to rest on the small, fresh mound of earth. He stood over Tommy's grave for a long time, the prairie wind tugging at his coat, whispering through the tall grass. He saw the boy's face in his mind's eye, full of awe and a desperate shining hope. A hope that Rip had gotten him killed. He had avenged the boy's death, but the act felt hollow, a debt paid in a currency that couldn't buy back a single breath. He was no hero. He was just a man who was good at killing, and the boy had mistaken that for something noble. A lone hawk circled in the vast, empty sky above. Rip watched it for a moment, a creature of pure, untroubled freedom. He looked down at the grave again, then out at the trail that led west, the trail that led away from this town and its ghosts. The trail was open. There was nothing stopping him. He stood there for a long time, a solitary, wounded figure in a field of the dead, caught between the life he had known and a future he could not begin to imagine. He did not leave. He just stood silent and still, as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Chapter 22. I thought I might find you here. Clara's voice was as soft as the afternoon light that filtered through the leaves of the lone cottonwood tree in the graveyard. Rip hadn't heard her approach. He was still standing on the hill, a solitary figure keeping a silent, wounded vigil over the town he had saved and the boy he had not. He turned slowly, his body a map of aches and stabbing pains, and saw her standing there. In her hands, she held a tin plate with a steaming cup of coffee and a single golden brown roll, glistening with melted butter and dusted with cinnamon. The scent drifted to him on the breeze, a fragrance of home, of kitchens, of a life so far removed from the trail of blood and gunpowder he had walked that it felt like it belonged to another world. The town is quiet, she said, stopping a few feet from him. The last of Creed's men were rounded up this morning. The ones that didn't run are locked in the blacksmith shed. Rip gave a slow nod, his eyes on the fresh graves. Good. Doc Chilton says you're lucky. The knife missed anything vital. He said you're made of leather and stubbornness. She held out the plate. You haven't eaten. It was not a request. He hesitated, then took the plate from her. His hand, calloused and scraped, trembled slightly as he wrapped it around the warm cup. The heat was a small, startling comfort. They stood in silence for a long time, looking down at Prospect Ridge. The street had been cleared of the dead. The barricades were already being dismantled. The sounds of hammering and quiet conversation drifted up the hill, the sounds of a town beginning the slow, arduous work of healing. I'm sorry about the boy, Rip, Clara said, her voice thick with a grief that was both personal and shared. He loved you. He looked at you, and he saw the kind of man he hoped he would one day become. Rip's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along his cheek. He saw a fool who got him killed. No, she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. He saw a man who stood up when every other man was running. Tommy made his own choice. He chose to be brave. You didn't give him that, but you showed him what it looked like. He had no answer for that. He took a bite of the roll. The taste of cinnamon and sweet bread was so foreign, so intensely comforting, it almost made him ache. It tasted like a life he'd never had. Bram is talking about holding a town council meeting tomorrow, Clara continued, her gaze fixed on the town below. They want to elect a new sheriff. Mayor Abernathy found his courage at the bottom of a bottle again, but the miners won't stand for him much longer. They want to offer the job to Bram. Bram's a good man, Rip said, his voice a rough rasp. He'll make a good leader. He will, she agreed. This town needs leaders. It needs people who aren't afraid to build, who aren't afraid to put down roots and make a stand. She paused, gathering her courage. The Dunn house, my hotel, the damage from the fight wasn't too bad. A few broken windows, some bullet holes in the wall. I can have it open in a week. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes clear and direct. A hotel needs more than a good kitchen. It needs a stable presence. It needs to feel safe. Our guests, the people who will come to build this town, will need to know that the rule of law is here to stay. That men like Silas Creed can't just ride in and burn it all down. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, as vast and open as the sky above. She was offering him more than a job. She was offering him a place, a home, a reason to stop riding. He looked away, toward the dusty trail that led west, the trail that had been his only constant companion. I'm not a lawman, Clara. I'm a drifter. trouble follows me." "Trouble is already here," she countered softly. "You're the one who taught us how to face it. All I'm saying is, Prospect Ridge has a future. And you have earned a place in it, if you want one." From the corner of his eye, Rip saw movement near the graveyard gate. It was Elias. He had been walking up the hill, perhaps to find his sister, but he had stopped when he saw her with Rip. He stood there, watching them, his face unreadable. Rip braced himself for the inevitable confrontation, the jealous rage, the bitter words. But they didn't come. Elias simply stood there, his gaze moving from his sister's earnest, hopeful face to Rip's own tortured, conflicted one. He saw the offer she was making. He saw the profound hesitation in the man who had saved them. And in that moment, the last of his resentment seemed to crumble away, replaced by a weary, hard-won understanding. He looked at Rip, the man he had once despised, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of concession, of peace, of respect. Rip saw the nod, and it hit him with more force than any of Smiley's blows. It was an acceptance, a blessing, an invitation from the one man he had expected nothing but hatred from. Clara, seeing that Rip would not or could not answer her, simply smiled a sad, gentle smile. "Just think on it," she whispered. She turned and walked back toward her brother, leaving Rip alone with the coffee, the cinnamon roll, and the impossible choice. He was surrounded, not by enemies, but by the decency and hope of good people. It was the most terrifying trap he had ever faced. He lifted the cup to his lips, the warmth spreading through his cold hands, and took a slow, hesitant sip of the hot black coffee. Chapter 23. "Does it hurt very much, Mr. Rip?" The question, small and earnest, pulled Rip from a heavy, haunted reverie. He looked down from his seat on the porch of the general store. Clara's little girl, May, stood before him, her brow furrowed with a child's solemn concern. She pointed a tiny finger not at the sling that held his arm, nor at the thick bandage on his thigh, but at his heart. Rip, who had faced down Silas Creed without flinching, found he could not meet the little girl's gaze. "Some," he admitted, his voice a low rasp. "Tommy had a hurt there too," she said quietly. "Mama said that's why he had to go be with the angels. So it wouldn't hurt anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and full of a wisdom that was far too old for her years. "Will you have to go be with the angels, too?" The simple, innocent question was a knife to Rip's soul, sharper and more painful than Smiley's blade had ever been. He had been sitting there for an hour, watching the slow, quiet resurrection of Prospect Ridge. He'd watched Bram, his arm now in a proper sling, directing the repairs on the blacksmith shed. He'd seen Elias poring over a ledger with the owner of the general store, his face set with a new, unfamiliar purpose. He'd watched Clara sweeping the porch of what would soon be her hotel, a small, determined figure claiming her future from the dust. They were all moving forward. But Rip was frozen, an anchor of violence and memory, in a town that was trying desperately to heal. "No, May," he said, his voice thick. "I'm not going anywhere just yet." She seemed satisfied with this answer. She looked at the dusty, battered hat on his head. "Tommy had a hat like yours." "I know," Rip said. "It was a good hat." "He was very proud of it," she whispered. The weight of it all, of Tommy's pride, of Clara's offer, of Elias's nod, pressed down on him. He looked at this small child, a fragile flower growing in the wreckage he had helped create. An unfamiliar impulse, a need to give something back instead of taking, rose up in him. With a grunt of pain, he pushed himself to his feet. "Stay here," he told the girl. He walked into the dim, cool interior of the general store, the bell above the door announcing his entrance with a cheerful jingle that was jarringly out of place. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dry goods. Elias looked up from his ledger, surprised. Rip ignored him, his eyes scanning the shelves. He found what he was looking for on a high shelf. A small stack of children's hats, simple straw, and felt things meant for homesteaders' sons and daughters. He pointed. The felt one. The blue one. The store owner, a portly man named Henderson, scurried to get it for him. Rip paid with one of the few coins he had left, the transaction feeling strange and foreign. He, a man who owned nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, was making a purchase. He was investing in something. He walked back out onto the porch where May was waiting patiently, just as he had asked. He knelt before her, the movement sending a sharp protest through his wounded leg. He held out the new hat. It was a simple, sturdy thing, with a small blue ribbon around the crown. "Every person out here needs a proper hat," he said gruffly, unable to summon any softer words. "To keep the sun off. This one is yours." May gasped, her eyes going wide with pure, unadulterated delight. She took the hat with both hands, her touch reverent. She placed it on her head, and a brilliant smile, a smile that seemed to push back all the shadows of the past week, lit up her face. It was the first real smile he had seen in what felt like an eternity. The sight of it, the simple, profound joy of it, struck Rip with the force of a physical blow. It was a feeling so potent, so unfamiliar, it almost buckled his knees. This was what it felt like. This was the something he had been hunting for on all those dusty trails. Not a place, not a job, but this feeling. This connection. This simple act of giving a small measure of happiness to another soul. And it terrified him. The feeling was a warm, dangerous tide, threatening to pull him under, to drown the drifter he had always been. As May ran off to show her new hat to her mother, Rip was left alone with the war raging inside him. He could stay. The thought was a whisper, a possibility that was now as real as the pain in his shoulder. He could accept Clara's offer. He could watch this town grow. He could be a part of May's life, watch her grow up under the brim of the hat he had given her. He could put down roots, hang up his gun, and let the man he used to be die. But the call of the trail was a siren song, a lifetime of habit that was hard to ignore. The open spaces promised freedom, but it was the freedom of being empty. No connections meant no loss. No love meant no grief. Staying here meant opening himself up to all of it again. It meant being responsible. It meant that the next time trouble came, the faces of the dead would be ones he knew, ones he cared for. Staying here weighed on him like a shroud. He looked at the town, at the people rebuilding their lives, and he felt like a wolf invited to live in the sheepfold. He didn't know if he could learn to be a sheepdog. He didn't know if he could ever stop being a wolf. The conflict, the war between the man he was and the man he could be, was tearing him apart. He pushed himself up, the porch seeming to sway beneath him. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed to think, and he couldn't do it here, surrounded by the life he was so afraid to choose. He turned his back on the street, on the hotel, on the little girl in the new blue hat, and began the slow, painful walk back up the hill, back toward the quiet company of the dead. Chapter 24. "Well, kid, I guess this is it." Rip's voice was a low whisper, lost in the high, lonely wind that swept across the graveyard. He stood before the small, fresh mound of earth, his battered hat held respectfully in his hands. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky in pale, fragile shades of rose and gray. A new day was coming to Prospect Ridge, a day he did not plan to be a part of. He knelt, the pain in his leg a dull, insistent throb, and rested a hand on the crude wooden cross at the head of Tommy's grave. The wood was rough, unfinished, but the name had been carved into it with care. Thomas Albright. A brave boy. "I never thanked you," Rip murmured to the silent ground. "For what you did. You saw Creed making a play for me, and you didn't hesitate. You stood up. You were the bravest man in that whole damn town." His throat grew tight, the words catching like burrs. "That hat looked good on you. Better than it ever looked on me." He stayed there for a long time, a silent communion passing between the living man and the dead boy. He told the boy everything he couldn't say to the living. He told him how sorry he was. He told him that his own life had been a long trail of running, and that the boy had made the mistake of seeing something noble in a man who was just good at violence. "I have to go, kid," the words formed in his mind, a silent, bitter confession. "Don't you see? I'm the storm. I'm the lightning that draws the fire. I stay here, and sooner or later, another creed will come sniffing around. And good people will get hurt. The best I can do for them now is to leave. The best I can do for Clara, for May, is to ride away and take my trouble with me." He convinced himself it was true. That leaving was an act of honor, a final service he could perform for the town he'd save. It was a clean, simple logic that appealed to the drifter in him, the man who had always believed that the best way to keep from hurting anyone was to never get close enough for them to matter. With a final, lingering touch on the wooden cross, he stood up. The decision, now sealed by this graveside vow, settled over him like a shroud. He placed his hat back on his head, pulling the brim low, and walked down the hill, away from the dead, his face set in a mask of grim resolve. He didn't go down the main street. He cut through the alleyways, a ghost moving through a town that was just beginning to stir. He saw smoke curling from the chimney of Clara's hotel kitchen, and smelled the faint, heartbreaking scent of baking bread. He heard the clang of a hammer from the blacksmith shop, the sounds of a life he was about to abandon. He reached the livery. Sandy, his tough, sand-colored mare, nickered softly as he approached, bumping her head against his good shoulder. "Easy, girl," he whispered, his voice thick. "We've got one more ride in us." The ritual of saddling the horse was a familiar comfort, a series of motions his body knew better than prayer. He checked the cinch, adjusted the bridle, tied his bedroll behind the cantle. Each movement was deliberate, final. He was erasing himself from this place. He swung into the saddle, the familiar creak of leather a lonely, final sound. He rode out of the livery and into the main street. The rising sun cast his shadow long before him. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, on the open country that beckoned, the vast, empty promise of the West. He did not look at the hotel. He did not look for a small girl in a blue hat. To look would be to falter, and he could not afford that. He rode past the general store, past the assayer's office, past the saloon. He reached the edge of town, where the muddy street gave way to the open trail, to the life he understood. Freedom was just a few more strides away. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distance, the scent of his own loneliness. He almost did it. He almost spurred Sandy into a canter, and never looked back. But then he stopped. He didn't know why. There was no sound, no single event that made him pull back on the reins. It was a feeling, a sudden, crushing weight. He sat on his horse, frozen at the invisible border between the town and the wilderness, between a future and his past. He thought of the trail ahead, the endless miles of dust and sky, the lonely campfires, the fleeting faces in forgotten towns. For the first time in his life, the image didn't bring a sense of freedom. It brought a profound, soul-crushing dread. The emptiness he had been running toward suddenly felt like a prison, far more confining than the small, struggling town behind him. Slowly, against every instinct for self-preservation he had ever cultivated, he turned his head and looked back. He saw it all. He saw the new wood replacing the battle-scarred walls. He saw the light in the window of Clara's hotel, a warm, golden promise against the morning gray. He saw the graveyard on the hill, a place that now held a piece of his own heart. He saw the faces of the people, Bram, Elias, the miners, the farmers. He saw Tommy's small, brave face. He saw May's delighted smile under the brim of her new hat. He wasn't just leaving a place. He was leaving a life. A life that had been offered to him. A life he had bled for. And he finally understood the last, hardest truth of all. Leaving wasn't a noble sacrifice to protect them. It was a coward's retreat to protect himself. It was the one last ride he had to stop running from. The trail ahead promised a familiar loneliness. The town behind him promised a terrifying hope. And there, on the edge of town, with the rising sun at his back, Rip Campbell finally made a choice. Chapter 25. The sun broke free of the horizon, spilling liquid gold across the prairie and setting the dust motes of the trail ablaze. For a long, silent moment, Rip Campbell sat on his horse, a man caught between two worlds, the past at his back and a vast empty freedom before him. He felt the pull of it, the siren song of the open range, a song he had danced to his entire life. It promised nothing, and in that promise there was a kind of safety. But when he had looked back at Prospect Ridge, he had not seen a collection of shabby buildings. He had seen a future. A hard, painful, uncertain future, yes, but one that held the scent of wood smoke and cinnamon, the sound of a child's laughter, and the steady gaze of a woman who looked at a killer and saw a man worth saving. He took a slow, deep breath, the cold morning air a clean shock to his lungs. The war inside him was over. A decision had been made, not in a flash of insight, but in the slow, grinding crucible of the last few weeks. He had arrived at the answer not by running, but by finally standing still. With a gentle pressure of his knee and a soft touch on the reins, he turned Sandy. The mare, accustomed to always moving forward, toward the setting sun, hesitated for a second, confused. Then, sensing the profound, settled shift in her rider, she obeyed. The act was quiet, devoid of drama, but it was the single most significant turn of Rip's life. He turned his back on the wilderness, on the endless, lonely trail. He faced the town. He rode back toward Prospect Ridge as the dawn broke in earnest. The graveyard on the hill, with its silent occupants and its ghosts of who he used to be, was now behind him. Something else lay ahead. He saw the town differently now. The muddy street was not a sign of filth, but a challenge to be met with gravel and planks. The bullet-scarred walls were not marks of defeat, but proof of resilience, a story of survival waiting to be told. The weariness on the faces of the people was not a weakness, but a testament to the strength it had taken them to endure. This was not a place to pass through. It was a place to build. As he rode down the main street, a figure appeared on the porch of the hotel. It was Clara. She stood with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill, a tin cup of coffee held in her hands. She had seen him ride out. He could see the ghost of that heartbreak in the tense set of her shoulders, the sorrow in her eyes as she watched him approach, likely thinking he had forgotten something, that this was just a final cruel delay of his departure. He rode Sandy right up to the porch of the Dunn house and stopped. He did not speak. He just looked at her, letting his presence, his return, be his first words. Clara stared at him, her knuckles white on her cup. Her expression shifted from weary resignation to confusion, and then to a fragile, burgeoning hope that was so powerful it was almost painful to witness. "I thought you were gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rip swung his leg over the saddle, the movement stiff and agonizing. He dismounted, landing on the street with a solid thud. The simple act of putting both feet on the ground in the center of this town was his answer. The drifter was done. "A town doesn't build itself," he said, his voice a low rumble. He walked to the steps of the porch, stopping at the bottom and looking up at her. "And a hotel needs a good man to keep the trouble out." A single tear traced a path down Clara's cheek, but she was smiling, a radiant, tear-stained smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Does it pay well?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I reckon we can work something out," he said. A hint of a smile, the first genuine one she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. Don't miss Buffalo Run, the next action-packed installment in the Rip Campbell series.